Welcome to the hot mess, Spain in the age of Ferdinand. The good news? You're in Spain. The bad news? So is Ferdinand. Picture this. It's the early 1800s, and Spain, once the glittering jewel of Europe, the land of conquistadors, galleons packed with gold, and empires that made maps weep with exhaustion, is now, well, a bit of a mess. Actually more like a royal-grade dumpster fire rolling downhill into a swamp. Spain had spent centuries punching above its weight with an empire so vast that the sun didn't set on it. But by the time Ferdinand VII enters the scene, the sun is setting, the lights are flickering, and someone's stolen the silverware. Spain's glory days of the 16th century, long gone. The mighty Armada, sunk, along with national pride. The American colonies, starting to whisper about independence. The economy, picture an old mule that's been pulling the empire's cart for 300 years. It's tired, cranky, and just kicked over the last bag of gold. And into this scene strolls Ferdinand, ready to, you'd hope, steady the ship. Instead, Spain under Ferdinand was like a ship that hit an iceberg, and then backed up to hit it again just for fun. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Let's not blame Ferdinand entirely. Yet, the Spain he inherited was already wobbling like a three-legged table. For starters, its monarchy had been ruled for generations by the House of Bourbon, a family that somehow specialized in producing monarchs with the political savvy of boiled cabbage. Charles IV, Ferdinand's dad, wasn't exactly what you'd call a strong king, more like the kind of guy who'd hand over the keys to the palace because someone asked nicely. Actually, scratch that, because his own prime minister convinced him to. That prime minister, Manuel Godoy, was more interested in staying on Queen Maria Luisa's good side, and historians still gossip about just how good a side that was, than in keeping the country afloat. Meanwhile, Europe was a live-action soap opera. Napoleon Bonaparte was strutting across the continent like a rooster on a caffeine rush. France was conquering, toppling thrones, redrawing maps like a bored kid with crayons. And poor Spain, right next door. It had tried to stay on Napoleon's good side, joining his wars, forming alliances, and generally being the loyal sidekick. But Napoleon was the kind of friend who borrows your car and returns it missing 2 tires and with a suspicious smell inside. Spain's army had been bled in endless wars. Its treasury was a hollow shell, its people, mostly exhausted, broke, and starting to mutter about how maybe the French Revolution hadn't been such a bad idea after all. By the early 1800s, Spain's colonies were also stirring. The colonies that had once funded the grand palaces and powdered wigs of Madrid were beginning to realize they didn't need Spain anymore. The Creole elites in places like Buenos Aires, Caracas, and Mexico City were reading revolutionary pamphlets, drinking imported coffee, and wondering why they should keep sending gold back to a country that couldn't even defend itself. And Ferdinand? He was waiting in the wings, watching the chaos unfold, probably thinking, how hard can it be to rule this place? Spoiler, really hard. Especially if your main skill is making things worse. When he finally gets his turn, he inherits a nation that's been double-crossed by France, humiliated on the battlefield, economically crippled, and teetering on the edge of civil unrest. But instead of steadying the kingdom, Ferdinand takes the wheel and aims straight for the nearest cliff, at full speed. What made it all the more absurd was how Spain in the early 1800s still clung to its image as a major European power. The country still strutted on the world stage like it was the 1500s, like it hadn't lost most of its navy, half of its dignity, and a good chunk of its empire. The reality? Spain was limping behind the other powers. Britain was busy inventing the Industrial Revolution. France was rewriting the laws of Europe. Even Prussia was flexing its muscles. Spain was arguing over who got to sit next to the king at dinner while the treasury ran dry. And the common folk? Oh, they were having a blast. If you liked famine, heavy taxes, conscription into pointless wars, and having your town burned by either invading French armies or your own soldiers, Spain was the place to be. The average peasant's dream was to survive long enough to complain about it over bad wine. So there you are, in a Spain where everything is crumbling, politically, economically, and socially. And the man who's about to take charge, Ferdinand VII, a king with the charisma of a damp sock, and the political wisdom of a man trying to put out a fire with olive oil. The perfect recipe for disaster. Now imagine backstabbing your dad to get the throne, only to have Napoleon steal it out of your hands like it's the last croissant. If you thought royal family drama peaked with Game of Thrones, let me introduce you to Ferdinand VII, Spain's very own discount version of a Machiavellian schemer. In the early 1800s, before he had the crown securely on his head, or firmly wedged where the sun doesn't shine, Ferdinand was busy doing what any responsible royal heir would do during a national crisis, plotting against his own father. Let's set the mood. Picture Ferdinand as a sulky, entitled young man, convinced that he alone could save Spain from the disaster it was becoming. Never mind that he had all the leadership skills of a damp sponge. His father, Charles I, wasn't exactly a titan of wisdom either. Charles was, shall we say, easily influenced. And by easily influenced, I mean he let his Prime Minister, Manuel Godoy, pretty much run the country, while he focused on hobbies like hunting, eating, and existing in a state of royal confusion. Enter Ferdinand, watching this train wreck unfold from the sidelines, thinking, "This is my chance." He began to surround himself with advisors who whispered in his ear day and night that Charles was weak, Godoy was corrupt, and that Ferdinand could do better. It didn't help that the Spanish people, sick of Godoy's incompetence and Charles's passivity, began to see Ferdinand as a potential saviour. Little did they know, their saviour came with a return policy that read, no refunds, no exchanges. So Ferdinand starts plotting, and not subtly, mind you. He writes secret letters to Napoleon, begging for support. Yes, Napoleon, the man who at this point had already turned half of Europe into his personal chessboard, and had no problem knocking over kings like they were bowling pins. Ferdinand basically slid into Napoleon's DMs asking for help overthrowing his dad, as if Napoleon wasn't already eyeing Spain like a wolf at a sheep convention. Ferdinand's loyalty, like a wet napkin, falls apart under pressure. By 1808, the tension in Spain had hit boiling point. The people were starving, the army was demoralized, and Godoy was hated with the fiery passion usually reserved for tax collectors and people who talk at the theatre. When news broke that Godoy had secretly agreed to let French troops march through Spain, supposedly to attack Portugal, but let's be real, Napoleon had bigger plans. The people lost it. Riots erupted. The royal family, holed up in their palace at Aranjuez, suddenly found themselves in real danger. And here comes the Mutiny of Aranjuez, a fancy name for what was basically an angry mob storming the palace, demanding Godoy's head on a pike, and pressuring Charles IV to abdicate. Ferdinand, ever the opportunist, stood there wide-eyed and innocent-looking, like he had nothing to do with the whole thing. But behind that royal poker face was a man who had been fanning the flames the entire time. The mob got their wish. Godoy was arrested. Charles I, exhausted and terrified, abdicated, and Ferdinand was crowned king. Victory, right? Well, not so fast. Ferdinand had pulled off the betrayal part like a pro, but as soon as he actually had to rule, the man folded faster than a cheap card table. His first royal act? Ride to Napoleon's court in Bayonne to thank him, or rather beg for approval, because Ferdinand, despite all his bravado, desperately wanted Napoleon's blessing. Big mistake. Napoleon took one look at Spain's royal mess and realized he could have the whole country for himself. So he invited both Charles IV and Ferdinand to Bayonne, because nothing says family vacation like travelling to meet the guy who's about to destroy you. And once they were there, Napoleon played them like fiddles. He forced both Charles and Ferdinand to abdicate. Ferdinand's prize for all his scheming, a one-way ticket to cosy captivity in France, where he would spend years as Napoleon's guest, while Napoleon handed the Spanish throne to his brother Joseph Bonaparte. So to recap, Ferdinand betrayed his father, helped ignite a mutiny, got the crown for 5 minutes, and then handed it to Napoleon without so much as a struggle. The man's plan worked right up until it mattered most. Then it disintegrated into humiliation. Spain, meanwhile, descended into full-blown chaos. The people who cheered for Ferdinand now found themselves ruled by a French puppet king. And Ferdinand? He was sipping French wine in a borrowed chateau, probably wondering how it had all gone so wrong. Spoiler. It went wrong the moment he thought Napoleon was his friend. Picture this. Spain is on fire. The people are rising up. The French are marching in. And your king? Oh, he's off enjoying a long, all-expenses-paid stay in France. Yes, while his country bled, Ferdinand VII was basically on the royal equivalent of a spa retreat, minus the mud baths, but with plenty of time to admire the wallpaper in his guest accommodations. Let's rewind for a second. After the disaster at Bayonne, where both Charles IV and Ferdinand abdicated, like two squabbling kids who'd just been scolded by their dad's scarier friend, Napoleon, in this case, Ferdinand was whisked off to France. Guest was the official term. Prisoner was the reality, but a very comfortable prisoner. Ferdinand wasn't tossed into a dungeon or chained to a wall. Oh no, Napoleon wanted to keep up appearances. After all, if you're going to puppet master Europe, it helps if your captive kings look relaxed. So Ferdinand found himself installed in the Château de Valenciennes, a lovely estate in the French countryside, complete with gardens, fine food, and no responsibility whatsoever. The man who'd schemed so hard for a throne now found himself with nothing to rule, except, perhaps, the wine list. While Spain plunged into one of its bloodiest conflicts, Ferdinand was busy doing, well, nothing useful. It's hard to defend your country when you're busy admiring French drapes. Back home, Napoleon had handed the Spanish crown to his brother Joseph Bonaparte, or as the Spaniards affectionately called him, Pepe Botella, thanks to rumours that he enjoyed a little too much of the good stuff. Joseph, poor soul, had the unenviable task of ruling a country that didn't want him, didn't like him, and definitely didn't intend to let him hang around. The Spanish people, who'd once welcomed Ferdinand as a saviour, now took up arms, not for Ferdinand. Mind you, he was sipping Bordeaux somewhere, but for their own pride, their religion, and their independence. What erupted was the Peninsular War, a brutal, drawn-out and gloriously chaotic mess that made Spain a living nightmare for the French. Peasants became guerrilla fighters, cities turned into battlegrounds, priests, farmers and merchants grabbed whatever they could, muskets, knives, pitchforks, and waged a relentless war of ambushes, sabotage, and sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. Every road was a trap, every town square was a powder keg. The French army, which had steamrolled through most of Europe, found itself bleeding in Spain, one ambush at a time. And Ferdinand, oh Ferdinand, one would think that, hearing of his people's heroic resistance, he might attempt something, anything, perhaps a stirring letter of support, an escape attempt, or at least a dramatic gesture of defiance. But no. Ferdinand was, as ever, the master of doing the absolute minimum. He played the role of guest prisoner with a kind of lazy grace, enjoying the fine meals, reading, hunting, and waiting for someone else to fix the mess he'd helped create. To be fair, just barely, he was a captive. But let's not kid ourselves. If Ferdinand had shown an ounce of leadership, a hint of courage, or the barest flicker of a plan, he might have inspired his people, even from afar. Instead, he stayed largely silent, watching from his gilded cage as Spain descended into a nightmare. Meanwhile, Napoleon's plan was unravelling spectacularly. The Peninsular War turned into the French Empire's slow, bloody ulcer. British forces under the Duke of Wellington joined the fray, helping Spanish insurgents turn the Iberian Peninsula into a meat grinder for French ambitions. The Spanish ulcer, as Napoleon called it, drained troops, resources, and morale, helping pave the way for his eventual downfall. And Ferdinand, still vacationing in France, his contribution to the war effort was roughly on par with that of the chateau's house cat. Actually, scratch that. The cat probably caught more mice than Ferdinand caught ideas about how to help his nation. This French vacation stretched on for years, from 1808 until 1814. That's 6 long years of Ferdinand watching events unfold from a distance, waiting for the storm to pass, and probably practicing his royal signature for when he'd eventually reclaim the throne. It's worth noting that while Spain's people sacrificed, fought, and died for their homeland, they clung to the idea of Ferdinand the Desired, the absent king who would one day return and make everything right. The irony is almost painful. The man they bled for was the same man who, given the chance, would return to crush their dreams of reform and freedom, the minute his boots touched Spanish soil again. But at the time, all they saw was a symbol, a distant monarch whose face adorned their banners, while he dined on French delicacies. The year is 1814. After 6 long years of brutal guerrilla warfare, shattered cities, and general French mischief, the Peninsular War finally grinds to a halt. Napoleon's empire is collapsing faster than Ferdinand's promises, and the Spanish people, exhausted but victorious, are ready to celebrate. They've held the line against Europe's most fearsome conqueror, all in the name of their absent king, El Deseado, the Desired One. That was what they called him, because nothing says national optimism like putting all your hopes in a guy who spent the entire war picking curtains in France. So when Ferdinand finally returned home, it was like the medieval equivalent of a rock star's homecoming tour. Crowds cheered, church bells rang, flower petals flew, the works. Spain's people believed that at last, their suffering had purpose. Ferdinand, they thought, would reward their loyalty by embracing the Constitution of 1812, a hard-won document that for the first time tried to drag Spain into the modern age. It promised freedoms, equality before the law, freedom of the press, limits on royal power. You know, small things like basic rights. The only thing Ferdinand reformed was his ability to make things worse faster. Unfortunately, they'd misjudged their king badly. Imagine gifting someone a puppy, only to have them kick it across the room. That's the level of emotional whiplash Spain felt when Ferdinand rolled in, accepted their applause, and then torched their dreams before the echoes of the cheers had even died down. Here's how it went. Ferdinand lands on Spanish soil and is handed a copy of the Constitution of 1812 by eager officials. Here, Your Majesty, the people's will, a new, better Spain. Ferdinand takes one look, smiles politely, and proceeds to yeet it straight into the dustbin of history. Okay, not literally, but close enough. He declared it null and void within weeks of returning. Instead of championing progress, Ferdinand announced that he'd been tricked into supporting constitutional ideas during his captivity. That's right, the same man who'd spent his years in France twiddling his thumbs now claimed he was a victim of manipulation. In reality, he couldn't stand the idea of shared power. Ferdinand wanted the good old days of absolute monarchy, where his word was law and dissenters got a one-way ticket to the dungeon. And boy did he get to work. First up, the reformers, the brave men who'd kept the Spanish government afloat during the war, who'd written the Constitution, who'd tried to modernize Spain. They suddenly found themselves public enemies. Some were imprisoned, others fled into exile, often to Britain or Latin America. A few unlucky souls were executed, because nothing says thanks for saving the kingdom like a swift hanging. Ferdinand didn't stop there. Censorship returned with a vengeance. The free press that had blossomed under the Constitution shut down. Political clubs banned. Universities purged of anyone with ideas that smelled even vaguely liberal. It was as if Spain had stepped into a time machine and hit reverse until they landed smack back in the Middle Ages. Meanwhile, Ferdinand ruled like a man who'd just discovered the joys of crushing hope. His court was filled with yes-men who flattered his ego while corruption flourished at every level. If you wanted a favor from the king, you didn't bring ideas or vision. You brought gifts, gold, or the promise to help him clamp down harder on anyone who dared utter the word Constitution. The irony: Spain had suffered, fought, and bled to resist French absolutism, only to reinstall a homegrown version the minute Ferdinand's boots hit Spanish soil. The liberal dream of 1812, equality, justice, a constitutional monarchy, was dead before it could even take root. And while the people had adored Ferdinand on his return, the mood soured fast. The same crowds who once showered him with flowers began to whisper, grumble, and finally seethe as they watched their freedoms disappear one by one. The man they'd called El Deseado quickly became El Detestado, the hated one. But Ferdinand didn't care. As far as he was concerned, Spain's only real problem was that people still kept trying to reform things. Now let's dive a bit deeper into life under absolute rule, censorship, spies, and fear. Free speech in Ferdinand's Spain, only if you enjoyed free housing in a dungeon. Imagine waking up each morning in Ferdinand VII's Spain and thinking, I wonder who's going to get arrested today. That's the kind of atmosphere Ferdinand cultivated. A kingdom where every conversation might be overheard, every letter read by prying eyes, and every opinion, unless it was Viva the King, could land you in a dark, damp cell, courtesy of His Most Catholic Majesty. When Ferdinand torched the Constitution of 1812 and slammed the door on reform, he didn't stop at abolishing a few rights here and there. No, he went full throttle into turning Spain into a surveillance state worthy of a dystopian novel. If, of course, novels hadn't already been censored into oblivion. Censorship wasn't just a policy under Ferdinand, it was practically a religion. Newspapers? Forget them. Unless you fancied reading royal decrees, announcements about saintly feast days, or the latest flattering description of Ferdinand's nose, independent thought, that was dangerous stuff. Books had to pass through royal censors, so meticulous they'd probably ban a cookbook if it suggested mixing liberal amounts of any ingredient. Even private letters weren't safe. The mail was routinely opened and examined, just in case Cousin Diego happened to slip in a cheeky complaint about the king's latest tax. Your options were stay quiet or get invited to a royal vacations with shackles. But it wasn't just the press or literature. Ferdinand understood that to truly rule through fear, you had to make everyone a suspect. Enter the network of informants. Picture a nation where your neighbor, your co-worker, even the guy who sells you bread, might also be on the royal payroll, eager to report any suspicious behavior. A careless joke, a grumble about rising taxes, a toast to the wrong figure at a tavern, all could end with a knock at the door in the middle of the night. The secret police, or as close as Spain got to one at the time, worked tirelessly to root out enemies of the crown. And by enemies we mean anyone with a brain cell that hadn't fully melted under the weight of royal propaganda. Suspected liberals, intellectuals, former constitutionalists, they were hauled before shadowy tribunals, imprisoned without trial, or shipped off into exile. Dungeons that had sat empty for decades were suddenly brimming with poets, professors, lawyers, and merchants whose only crime was wanting a government that wasn't stuck in 1492. Paranoia spread like wildfire. Families were torn apart as fathers, brothers, and sons disappeared into the royal justice system. People learnt to whisper, to check over their shoulders, to nod and smile when someone praised the king. No matter how bitter the taste, the Spain of Ferdinand's absolute rule wasn't just oppressed, it was suffocating under the weight of its own fear. Let's not forget the clergy. Many churchmen, especially the higher-ups, adored Ferdinand's reactionary policies. Together, crown and altar formed a delightful alliance that kept the masses in check. Sermons doubled as royal press releases. Dissent was framed not only as treason, but as heresy. Oppose the king, you weren't just a bad subject, you were a sinner, too. A neat trick, really. Double the guilt, double the dread. And what about public life? Gone. Political clubs, banned. Debates, non-existent. Town halls, reduced to venues for royal celebrations and the occasional public flogging of someone who dared to own a banned pamphlet. The arts, they survived, but only in the most sanitized, non-threatening forms. A play about a brave citizen standing up to injustice. Forget it. A drama about how the king's wisdom saved the day. Now that would get you funding. Even economic life suffered. When a society is too terrified to think, speak, or innovate, progress grinds to a halt. Entrepreneurs who might have introduced new ideas kept their heads down. Merchants who'd prospered under freer trade watched their businesses struggle under the weight of endless regulations and corruption. Spain, already lagging behind much of Europe, slid even further into stagnation. Ferdinand's method of rule boiled down to this: if you can't inspire loyalty through greatness, enforce it through terror. His Spain wasn't a nation of subjects bound together by pride, but one of hostages bound together by fear. And the most tragic part, the people who'd once cheered him home, who'd believed he would reward their sacrifices, they were the ones who suffered most, watching as hope was crushed beneath the boots of absolutism. Spain's empire was like sand through Ferdinand's fingers, and somehow he had butter on his hands. If there were Olympic medals for mismanaging an empire, Ferdinand VII would have taken home gold, silver, and bronze, and somehow dropped all three on his way to the podium. By the time he finally crawled back onto the Spanish throne in 1814, the colonies that had once poured gold and silver into Spanish coffers were already smouldering with revolution. And what did Ferdinand do to stop the inferno? Well, let's just say his strategy made Napoleon's Russian campaign look like a brilliant success. To understand how bad it got, we need to zoom out. Spain's empire in the Americas was once the envy of Europe. From Mexico down to Argentina, Spanish viceroys ruled over vast territories rich in resources, and until they rebelled loyal subjects. But during Ferdinand's French vacation, the colonies had gotten a taste of self-rule. They'd formed local juntas, governed themselves, and surprise, discovered they liked it. Turns out people tend to enjoy running their own affairs without waiting for a royal decree from a king who can't even keep his own country from falling apart. Ferdinand's idea of diplomacy? Send troops. If that fails, send more troops. If that fails, nap time. So when Ferdinand returned, the colonies expected maybe some acknowledgement of their sacrifices during the war, or at least a bit of dialogue. Nope. Ferdinand took one look at these uppity colonies and thought, how dare they think for themselves? His grand plan: ignore their demands, refuse to grant any meaningful reforms, and instead send over wave after wave of poorly equipped troops to remind them who was boss. Spoiler: it didn't go well. Take Mexico. In 1810, Father Miguel Hidalgo's cry for independence had already set the wheels of revolution in motion. By the time Ferdinand returned, the Spanish grip was slipping fast. Did Ferdinand try to negotiate, offer autonomy, propose a Commonwealth model like Britain would with Canada or Australia? Of course not. He doubled down on absolutism, convinced that sheer force would make the colonies fall back in line. His response to petitions was essentially, no rights, no reforms, just troops. And oh, those troops. Spain sent soldiers across the Atlantic who were often unpaid, ill-supplied, and led by generals who thought strategy meant charge at them and hope for the best. The result? Disaster after disaster. Revolutionaries like Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, and Bernardo O'Higgins didn't just defeat Spanish forces, they humiliated them. Spanish garrisons surrendered, entire fleets were captured or sunk, and royal governors fled their capitals as independence movements steamrolled across the continent. Meanwhile, Ferdinand's court acted as if this was all a minor inconvenience. They kept issuing decrees as if the colonies would come crawling back any day now. Ferdinand's ministers would gather, draft another stern letter, or plan another doomed military expedition, and then toast to the king's inevitable victory, while Spanish authority in the Americas crumbled like week-old bread. And the cost? Oh, it was staggering. Not just in treasure, though the loss of colonial revenues sent Spain's already weak economy spiraling, but in blood and credibility. Spain became the laughingstock of Europe, clinging to a dying empire with all the desperation of a gambler, betting the house on one last doomed hand. Perhaps the most tragicomic part of it all was that Ferdinand could have taken another path. Even some of his advisors suggested compromise, offering constitutional guarantees, regional autonomy, maybe even creating a federation. But Ferdinand's motto seemed to be, if I can't rule absolutely, I won't rule at all. So he kept fighting and losing and fighting some more, until by the 1820s the Spanish flag was barely flying anywhere in the New World outside of Cuba and Puerto Rico. And what did Ferdinand do as colony after colony declared independence? He mostly moped, sulked, and issued proclamations no one read. It was as if he believed that, if he just ignored reality hard enough, maybe it would go away. By the end of his reign, Spain's once mighty empire had shrunk to a sad shadow of its former self, all thanks to a king whose stubbornness was matched only by his astonishing lack of vision. Now it's 1820, and Spain has had enough. After years of Ferdinand's iron-fisted rule, the censorship, the secret police, the empire slipping through his fingers like buttered toast, even the army is getting twitchy. Enter the liberal triennium, or as Ferdinand probably called it, 3 very annoying years. It all kicked off with a mutiny, so embarrassing that even Ferdinand's courtiers must have struggled to stifle their giggles. A colonel named Rafael del Rigo, sick of being packed off on yet another doomed mission to the Americas, decided, you know what, let's not sail across the ocean to lose another war, let's stay here and demand a constitution. And wouldn't you know it, the troops agreed. The mutiny spread like wildfire. Pretty soon, the whole country was buzzing with demands for Ferdinand to dust off that pesky constitution of 1812, the one he'd tossed out like yesterday's leftovers in Chapter 4. Ferdinand, caught completely off guard, because who could have imagined that starving, overworked soldiers and angry citizens might want change, did what he did best. He lied through his teeth. Oh yes, he promised, he'd be delighted to rule under the constitution. Absolutely thrilled. He swore loyalty to the liberal order, posed for paintings looking pious and regretful, and probably practiced his "who me, I love democracy" face in the mirror. Spain, we want rights. Ferdinand, how about French bayonets instead? But behind the scenes, Ferdinand was plotting harder than a villain in a soap opera. His letters to Europe's crowned heads were practically begging for help. "Dear cousin Louis, could you maybe spare an army? Things are getting awfully democratic over here, and I hate it." Meanwhile, the 3 years of constitutional rule were, well, messy. The liberals tried to make Spain a modern constitutional monarchy. They reopened universities, restored freedom of the press, what a novelty, and attempted reforms. But they were up against centuries of reactionary inertia, bitter factionalism, and oh yes, a king who was actively sabotaging them at every turn. Ferdinand, while pretending to cooperate, worked tirelessly to undermine everything. He encouraged loyalists to stir up unrest, spread rumors that the liberals were out to destroy the church, a reliable panic button in Spain, and generally acted like a sullen teenager, forced to do chores. His goal, make the whole experiment look like a disaster, so he could swoop back in as the savior of order. And then, jackpot. In 1823, his desperate letters finally paid off. The French king, Louis VII, not exactly a poster boy for progressive values himself, agreed to help. France sent a force, hilariously named the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis. It sounded noble. In practice, it was 100,000 bayonets marching into Spain to rescue Ferdinand from the horror of having to follow a constitution. Ferdinand's reaction? Pure glee. He couldn't roll out the red carpet fast enough. As the French army advanced, the liberal government crumbled. Some tried to resist, but between Ferdinand's scheming and the sheer size of the invading force, resistance was about as effective as a paper umbrella in a hurricane. When the dust settled, Ferdinand didn't even pretend to be grateful. He immediately went back to his old tricks, abolishing the constitution again, jailing liberals again, and proving that his word was worth less than a counterfeit coin in a back-alley market. The so-called restored order was just Ferdinand pressing rewind on absolutism, but with the added bonus of foreign troops sticking around for a while to help him stomp out dissent. And the people, crushed, disillusioned, and exhausted. They dared to hope, dared to believe that Spain could join the modern age. Instead, they got French intervention, more oppression, and a king who seemed incapable of learning anything, except maybe how to fail upwards. If you thought Ferdinand VII's political career was a mess, wait until you peek behind the palace curtains. The man's personal life was less dignified monarch and more walking tabloid headline. In fact, if reality TV had existed in the 1800s, The Real Royals of Madrid starring Ferdinand would have been a smash hit, complete with scandal, drama, and plenty of eye-rolling from the servants. Let's start with his favourite hobby outside of wrecking Spain, marriage. Ferdinand wasn't content with just one royal wedding disaster. He went for four marriages, each more tragicomic than the last. It wasn't so much about love as it was about producing the all-important heir. Spain was desperate for a successor who wasn't Ferdinand, and Ferdinand was desperate to keep his power firmly in the family, even if it meant turning the royal palace into the set of a soap opera. Wife #1. Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, a teenage bride sent from sunny Naples to chilly Madrid. Maria Antonia married Ferdinand in 1802. The union was supposed to cement alliances and secure the Bourbon dynasty. Instead, it was a short-lived tragedy. Ferdinand, moody and self-pitying, barely played the role of husband. Maria Antonia, reportedly kind and intelligent, suffered in a court as cold as its king. She died young in 1806, possibly from tuberculosis, though of course, the gossips whispered about poison, intrigue and palace plots. After all, this was Ferdinand's court. Subtlety wasn't part of the decor. Wife #2, Maria Isabel of Portugal. Round 2. In 1816, Ferdinand married his niece. Yes, niece, Maria Isabel of Portugal. Dynastic marriages often kept it in the family, but this was eyebrow-raising even by royal standards. Maria Isabel, sweet-natured but ill-fated, died in childbirth just 2 years later, taking their infant with her. For all his obsession with heirs, Ferdinand's luck with producing them was about as good as his luck keeping colonies, which is to say, terrible. Wife #3, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony. Surely third time's the charm. Nope. In 1819, Ferdinand wed Maria Josepha Amalia, a shy and devout German princess who spent most of her marriage trying to avoid him. She was so terrified of intimacy that the couple reportedly didn't consummate their union for years. Ferdinand, never known for patience, wasn't thrilled. Neither were his advisors, who were counting on a baby to stabilize the throne. Maria Josepha died childless, leaving Ferdinand's succession crisis unresolved, and his mood fouler than ever. Wife #4, Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies. Finally, in 1829, Ferdinand married Maria Cristina, a much younger princess from Naples, because that had worked so well the first time. This was his last-ditch attempt to secure the dynasty. To everyone's shock, it worked. Maria Cristina gave birth to the future, Isabella II, in 1830, just in time to trigger the next royal drama, Succession Wars. Now, while Ferdinand cycled through wives like a man trying on ill-fitting shoes, his court life was equally chaotic. The king's gluttony was legendary. He ate like a man who believed each meal might be his last, which, given his health, wasn't a bad bet. Rich stews, mountains of pastries, oceans of wine, he consumed them all with gusto. His waistline grew as his empire shrank, and exercise. Let's just say Ferdinand wasn't known for his morning jogs. If moving from his throne to the dining table counted as cardio, he was a fitness guru. Spain needed a leader. It got a royal toddler in a fancy hat. Then there were the tantrums. Court records and foreign diplomats describe a king who, in private, behaved less like a monarch and more like a spoiled child, denied his favorite toy. He sulked. He screamed. He threw things, sometimes at ministers, sometimes at servants, and once, if you believe the gossip, at a visiting ambassador who had the misfortune of delivering bad news. One aide reportedly said that trying to reason with Ferdinand was like trying to argue with a thunderstorm. Loud, unpredictable, and best survived by keeping your head down. And through all this, the Spanish people could only watch in horror and disbelief. Their king, the man tasked with guiding the nation through one of its most difficult periods, was too busy throwing royal hissy fits and auditioning for worst husband of the century. It was as if Ferdinand's personal motto was, if I can't lead well, at least I can entertain the gossip columnists. If you thought Ferdinand's early reign was chaotic, his final years were like watching a slow-motion carriage crash. By the 1830s, Ferdinand VII wasn't just ruling Spain. He was haunting it, a bloated, gout-ridden ghost of the man who'd once backstabbed his father and botched every major decision since. His health was in freefall, his politics even worse. Let's start with his body. Years of gluttony, laziness, and royal indulgence had caught up with him in spectacular fashion. Ferdinand waddled rather than walked, plagued by obesity so severe that courtiers whispered about the sheer effort it took to stuff him into his royal regalia. Gout gnawed at his joints, making each step a painful ordeal. Some accounts even describe him needing to be carried about like some oversized toddler in a fancy hat, which, given his tantrum-prone nature, wasn't far off the mark. And as his body failed him, so did his mind. Ferdinand grew increasingly paranoid, convinced that everyone, ministers, relatives, even his own servants, was out to betray him, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely unfounded, given his track record of making enemies faster than he could fire courtiers. But instead of calming down or focusing on uniting his fractious kingdom, Ferdinand doubled down on suspicion, surrounding himself with flatterers and spies who told him exactly what he wanted to hear, that he was brilliant, beloved, and totally not steering Spain into disaster. His last royal decree? Leave Spain a civil war as a parting gift. And here's where Ferdinand's final act became his most explosive. For years, the big question looming over Spain was who would take the throne when this human disaster finally kicked the bucket. The problem? Ferdinand only had one surviving child, a daughter, little Isabella. And while most of Europe had gotten used to queens now and then, parts of Spain were stuck on the idea that only a male heir would do. Enter Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, a reactionary's reactionary. Carlos and his supporters believed the throne was rightfully his. After all, Spain had something called the Salic Law on the books, a rule imported from France that banned women from inheriting the crown. This law had kept Isabella out of the line of succession until Ferdinand decided, in what may have been his only forward-thinking act, to change the rules. In 1830, Ferdinand issued the Pragmatic Sanction, which sounds fancy but boiled down to, I hereby say my daughter gets to be queen. So there. This decree undid the Salic law and named Isabella as heir. It was a political grenade lobbed into an already divided country. Conservatives, absolutists, and all-around fans of the good old days, you know, when Ferdinand was jailing liberals lined up behind Don Carlos. Liberals, constitutionalists, and anyone sick of Bourbon male drama backed Isabella. Ferdinand, bloated and wheezing on his throne, probably imagined he'd secured his dynasty. Instead, he'd set the stage for decades of civil war. The Carlist wars would rip Spain apart, pitting brother against brother, village against village, and leaving a trail of misery that made even Ferdinand's reign look tame by comparison. His final gift to Spain wasn't peace or prosperity. It was bloodshed and chaos, wrapped up in a royal decree and tied with a bow of paranoia. In his last months, Ferdinand deteriorated rapidly. He spent more time in bed than on the throne, his body racked with pain, his mind swirling with suspicions. Ministers came and went, each trying and failing to bring some kind of stability. Meanwhile, palace intrigue reached new heights, with Maria Cristina, his queen and regent-to-be for Isabella, maneuvering furiously to protect her daughter's rights. And yet, despite all the drama, Ferdinand clung to life with stubbornness worthy of a man who'd spent his whole reign refusing to learn from his mistakes. By the time he finally died in 1833, Spain was already on the edge of civil war, with rival factions sharpening their swords and dusting off old grudges. The country might have hoped for a period of peace after Ferdinand's exit. Instead, they got the Carlist nightmare. Ferdinand's legacy, how to be remembered for all the wrong reasons. Ferdinand, proof that a bad king can outlast good intentions. When Ferdinand VII finally shuffled off this mortal coil in 1833, he didn't just leave behind a grieving widow, a toddler queen, and a palace full of unpaid bills. No, he gifted Spain something far more destructive: decades of turmoil, civil war, and the kind of national trauma that historians still shake their heads at today. It's almost impressive. Most monarchs dream of being remembered for their wisdom, their victories, or at least their magnificent mustaches. Ferdinand, he secured his place in history by being the king everyone wished they could forget. Let's start with the immediate aftermath of his death. His pragmatic sanction, that last-minute rule change allowing his daughter Isabella to inherit, did not exactly smooth the path for a peaceful succession. Quite the opposite. The ink on Ferdinand's death certificate was barely dry when Spain erupted into the first of the Carlist wars. On one side, the supporters of little Queen Isabella II, waving their constitutional banners and hoping for a more modern monarchy. On the other, the Carlists, fans of Don Carlos, Ferdinand's brother, who believed in old-school, no-girls-allowed royal succession. What followed was a civil war that turned large parts of Spain into a battlefield. Villages were torched, families were split, whole regions descended into violence. And the best part, this was just the beginning. Thanks to Ferdinand's policies, or, more accurately, his lack of any coherent long-term vision beyond crushed dissent, eat stew, repeat. Spain would spend the next few decades staggering from crisis to crisis, coup to coup, like a drunk trying to walk a straight line at a sobriety checkpoint. His greatest achievement? Inspiring future rulers to try literally anything else. The Carlist wars were just the tip of the disaster iceberg. Ferdinand's constant flip-flopping between absolutism and pretending to play nice with liberals left Spain's political culture deeply fractured. Nobody trusted the monarchy, nobody trusted the army, and frankly, nobody trusted their neighbours either. His reign didn't just spark civil wars, it baked instability into the very bones of Spain's institutions. Want to know why Spain in the 19th century looked like a never-ending game of which general gets to be dictator this week? Look no further than Ferdinand's reign for the source code. And what do historians make of all this? Let's just say, Ferdinand doesn't exactly top the lists of best Spanish monarchs. In fact, most experts rank him among the worst. Not just for his incompetence, though that was impressive in its own right, but for his talent at making bad situations worse. Where other kings built, Ferdinand dismantled. Where others sought compromise, Ferdinand preferred repression. His solution to every problem seemed to be 1. Ignore it until it becomes a crisis, 2. Crush the opposition, and 3. Take a nap. Consider how other monarchs tried to steer their countries through the chaos of the Napoleonic era. Some modernized, some reformed, some at least tried to keep their people united. Ferdinand, he achieved the rare feat of making Spain's problems bigger at every turn. His greatest legacy, if we can call it that, was teaching future rulers exactly what not to do. Isabella II's regency and reign became a kind of national experiment in how to undo Dad's mess, though with decidedly mixed results. And it wasn't just at home. Ferdinand's catastrophic leadership helped accelerate the loss of Spain's overseas empire. By the time he was done, the once vast Spanish colonial holdings were mostly gone, snapped up by revolutionaries who had realized they could do better than a king, who spent most of his time either imprisoned, paranoid, or pestering his ministers for more pastries. Even today, Ferdinand's name is a byword in Spain for disastrous leadership. Mention him in a Spanish history class, and you'll get the academic equivalent of a collective sigh. He's remembered as a monarch who took a bad situation and made it worse, repeatedly, and with remarkable consistency. If there's a Mount Rushmore of failed kings, Ferdinand's face is front and center, probably with a smug expression and a gravy stain on his collar. So what's the moral of Ferdinand's legacy? It's that power without wisdom is a recipe for disaster. That stubbornness, selfishness, and short-term thinking can wreck a nation faster than any foreign invader. And that sometimes, the greatest gift a king can give his country is to not be king at all. Welcome to the siege, trapped like rats in a stone cage. Picture this. It's a fine spring morning. The birds are chirping, the sun is shining, and you're just about to take a bite of some crusty medieval bread so tough it could double as a weapon. And then, boom, the first boulder crashes into your outer wall, courtesy of the enemy's catapult. Congratulations, you are now officially under siege. The good news? You're safe behind thick stone walls. The bad news? You're safe behind thick stone walls. Forever. So how does a siege even start? Well, a siege is what happens when an army looks at your castle, rubs its hands together, and decides, yes, this is where we shall camp until everyone inside either starves or gives up. Sometimes it's planned. Maybe you insulted the wrong nobleman, or your lord forgot to pay his taxes to the king one too many times. Other times, it's pure bad luck. Maybe you were on the way to the market, and a passing army thought your castle would make a nice weekend project. And let's not forget betrayal. There's always that one guy, some underpaid gatekeeper who opens the side door because the enemy offered him a bag of coins and a promise not to kill him too quickly. Maybe you trusted your neighbors. That was your first mistake. Now back to you. The first moments of a siege are surprisingly awkward. It's not all fire and screaming yet. At first, it's a lot of peeking nervously over the battlements, while your enemy sets up camp just out of arrow range. They're putting up tents, building catapults, and lighting campfires. It's like watching someone set up for a picnic, where you're the main course. Inside the castle, panic hasn't quite set in yet. The Lord is strutting around shouting encouraging things like, "They'll never take us alive," or "Reinforcements will be here any day now." The guards are pretending to look serious while secretly wishing they'd called in sick today. The servants are already thinking about how long the food might last. And you're wondering why nobody thought to build a bigger well, or at least stockpile more ale. The walls, those glorious, thick, towering walls that were supposed to keep you safe. Right now, they feel like a blessing. But give it a few days, and those same walls will start to feel more like a prison. Sure, they keep the enemy out, but they also keep you in. Every doorway, every window, every crack in the stone becomes another reminder that there's nowhere to run. You'll start noticing things you never did before. That drafty hole near the north tower, the way the main gate sags just a little too much, or how the wall near the stables was never repaired properly after that storm 3 years ago. Suddenly, your grand fortress looks less like an impenetrable stronghold, and more like a really ambitious pile of rocks. Morale on day one? Surprisingly high, people tell themselves. It'll be over by Sunday, right? Someone starts a betting pool on how long the siege will last. The cooks hand out what's left of the fresh bread, and everyone has an extra ration of ale. The guards swap jokes at their posts. From the top of the walls you can see the enemy making their preparations, and there's this hopeful voice inside you saying, maybe they'll get bored and go home. Spoiler, they won't. The enemy is in no hurry. They've brought enough supplies to camp out for weeks, months, even. They're settling in for a long, slow grind, and you'll be there to witness every minute of it. And as the sun sets on that first day, the mood begins to shift. The jokes feel forced. The betting pool goes quiet. The ale starts to run low. The good news? You're still alive. The bad news? So is everybody else. And soon enough, you'll all be competing for the same dwindling resources. You go to bed that night on a straw mattress, fully dressed, sword at your side, because you never know when you'll need it. Staring at the ceiling and thinking about how you got here. Was it worth it? Could you have chosen another trade? Maybe something less stressful, like a traveling juggler or a monk who brews beer. Too late now. You're officially a participant in the grand medieval pastime known as being stuck inside a castle, while a bunch of angry men try to break in. And so, day one ends. The fires outside the walls glow in the distance. The sound of enemy hammers and saws fills the night air as they build their machines of war. You close your eyes and try to sleep, but all you can think is tomorrow. Tomorrow, the real fun begins. By day 2, or maybe day 5, honestly, you lose track pretty quickly. Your grand heroic defense has settled into something far less glamorous. Pure mind-numbing routine. There's no epic music swelling in the background, no dramatic speeches, just the slow, grinding realization that being under siege mostly means doing the same boring, miserable tasks over and over again, until you either die or get very good at not caring. Let's start with guard duty. You imagine standing proudly on the battlements, sword in hand, eyes scanning the horizon for signs of danger. The reality, you're up there at dawn, freezing your chainmail off in the morning mist, blinking against the rising sun, and trying not to yawn so wide that you fall off the wall. The enemy army? They're just sitting in their camp, drinking, playing dice, and occasionally waving at you like old friends. And you're desperately trying not to fall asleep on your feet, because the only thing worse than getting yelled at by your captain is getting shot by an enemy archer, because you nodded off next to the murder hole. And speaking of murder holes, those delightful little gaps in the walls that let you pour boiling oil or drop rocks on the heads of your attackers, they now serve a much less exciting purpose. Mainly, you peer through them for hours at a time, watching absolutely nothing happen. It's like medieval television, all reruns, no plot twists. Then there's patching the walls. Remember that spot near the stables where the masonry was crumbling? No? Well, you do now, because it's your job to slap some mud and sticks into it and pray it holds. You'll be sent down with a bucket of mortar, a pile of splintery wood, and an encouraging shove from your superior. Fun fact, mortar mixed in a hurry under siege conditions has roughly the structural integrity of porridge. But hey, it's not like you have a choice. When you're not guarding or patching, you're doing what passes for maintenance inside the castle. That means hauling buckets of water up endless stairs, because whoever designed castles was clearly an optimist about human leg strength, or helping reinforce doors and gates that you really hope won't need reinforcing. You might be tasked with moving rocks from one place to another for reasons no one bothers explaining. Or maybe you'll join the endless work parties trying to keep the inside of the castle from collapsing faster than the outside. And now we get to the real horror. Sanitation. Let's be clear, there's no medieval sewage system here. There's no plumbing, no drainage, no magical pipe that carries waste away to some distant land where it becomes somebody else's problem. No, it's just you, your neighbours, and an ever-growing army of chamber pots. Every corner of every room has at least one. The smell? Imagine if a farmyard and a fish market had a very unhappy baby, and that baby had been left in the sun for a week. That's your castle now. And every so often, someone draws the short straw and has to empty all those pots, usually by dumping the contents out of a window and hoping the wind is on their side. And let's talk about boredom. Oh sweet, crushing boredom. The enemy might be outside your walls, but your biggest enemy is time itself. You run out of things to do, you run out of people to argue with, you run out of jokes, songs, and even curses, so you invent new ways to entertain yourself. Counting the rats that skitter across the floor becomes a competitive sport. Bonus points if you spot one missing a tail or an ear. Arguments break out over who gets the last piece of stale bread. Not because anyone actually wants it, it's as hard as a rock, but because it gives people something to do. You find yourself debating whether that damp stain on the wall looks more like a dragon or a pig. It's definitely a pig. And as for your living quarters, well, remember how you thought you were lucky to have a spot by the window? Turns out that window is draftier than a sailor's trousers in a storm. Your bed? A pile of straw that itches in places you'd rather not mention. And the most exciting part of your day? Moving your chamber pot to a new corner, just for a change of scenery. By now, your boots are giving you blisters, your clothes haven't been washed since the siege began, and your hair is doing things that defy explanation. You smell like sweat, smoke, and sadness. You dream of fresh air, clean water, and a bed that doesn't come with its own ecosystem. But don't worry, you'll get through this. Probably, maybe, assuming the walls hold, the food lasts, the water doesn't run out, and you don't go completely mad from boredom first. The good news? Tomorrow will be exactly the same. The bad news? Tomorrow will be exactly the same. Let's talk about food, or, more accurately, the slow and painful disappearance of anything that could remotely be called food. At the start of the siege, you might have felt pretty confident. After all, there were barrels of salted meat, sacks of grain, wheels of cheese, and maybe even a few baskets of apples. The Lord's pantry seemed full. The cellars were stocked. The cooks were still smiling. Fast forward a few weeks, and things are looking, let's say, less promising. That glorious cheese? Mouldy. The salted meat? Somehow both rock hard and suspiciously slimy at the same time. The apples? Long gone, probably traded to the captain of the guard for the privilege of standing near the less drafty part of the wall. The grain? Well, it's still around, but it's starting to look like it has more bugs than actual grain in it. But hey, extra protein. Right, thus begins the great medieval siege diet, otherwise known as lose weight fast, whether you like it or not. Gone are the days of fresh bread. Now, your bread is more like a brick. You could build a house with it, but eating it, that's a challenge. The crust is so hard it could chip a tooth, and the inside is either rock solid or weirdly damp, depending on just how long it's been sitting there. Still, you gnaw at it, because it's better than nothing. Barely. And then there's the mystery stew. Oh yes, the once proud cooks of the castle, reduced from preparing hearty feasts to dumping whatever they can find into the same enormous pot, day after day. What's in it? Great question. No one really knows. Sometimes it tastes vaguely like cabbage, sometimes like onions, sometimes like despair. The texture is always the same, somewhere between soup and sludge, and let's not even talk about the colour. It's the sort of brown that only exists in medieval kitchens and the bottom of boots. Eventually, the meat runs out, and that's when the true desperation begins. Anything that doesn't bite back first is now fair game. Pigeons? Delicious. Rats? Why not? The family cat? You tell yourself it ran away. The dog? Don't think about it too hard. Even the leather straps on your boots start looking a bit too much like jerky for comfort. The castle garden, if you even have one, is stripped bare within the first week. No more herbs, no more carrots, no more sad little leeks. You've eaten it all. Even the weeds start to look appetizing. Some brave or foolish soul might try boiling grass or moss, just to see if it can be done. Spoiler, it can't, at least not in a way that doesn't make you wish you hadn't tried. And while your stomach grumbles louder than the enemy's siege engines, there's another grim reality to contend with. The politics of the plate. See, not everyone is starving at the same rate. The lord and his family, they're still getting the last of the good stuff. The captains and knights, they're at least getting double portions of whatever horror is in the pot. You, well, you're somewhere near the bottom of the pecking order. You get what's left, if anything is left. Maybe a ladle of broth so thin you can see the bottom of the bowl through it. Maybe the last crust of bread that even the rats turned their noses up at. And don't think for a moment that this goes unnoticed. Every meal, if you can call it that, becomes an awkward game of who's pretending not to be angry. People eye each other's portions like hawks. Someone always complains that the cook gave their neighbour a bigger slice. Fights break out over scraps. Someone inevitably tries to sneak extra from the pot and ends up with a black eye for their trouble. And the cook, poor soul, once the most respected person in the castle, now the most cursed. No one thanks the cook anymore. They just glare and grumble and dream of roast chicken and fresh pies. The hunger does strange things to people's minds. You start to dream about food constantly. You hallucinate smells that aren't there. Fresh bread baking, roasted meat, spiced wine. You catch yourself gnawing the end of your belt absent-mindedly. You find yourself seriously considering whether that candle wax might be edible if you just soften it enough. And the worst part? The enemy outside the walls knows you're starving. Sometimes they'll even taunt you by roasting meat over open fires where you can see it, letting the smell drift over the walls just to torment you further. It's psychological warfare at its cruelest. You're trapped, you're hungry, and you're powerless to do anything about it. So welcome to the fine art of starving in style. No menus, no choices, no hope of a second helping, just you, your empty belly, and the slow countdown to either surrender or madness. If you thought food during a siege was bad, just wait until you get thirsty. And oh, you will get thirsty. Because after a few days of surviving on brick bread and rat stew, your body starts screaming for something, anything to wash it down, and that's when you discover the next horror of siege life. Medieval hydration. Let's start with the well. The castle well. Your supposed saviour, that deep, dark shaft of hope, sunk lovingly into the earth to provide fresh water for exactly this kind of emergency. Except, guess what? The attackers know about the well too, and one of the first things any half-decent besieging army does is either block, break, or poison it. A dead cow dumped down the shaft. A few unfortunate prisoners thrown in for good measure. Maybe they just set fire to the wellhead, or collapse the entrance. Whatever method they choose, your fresh water source is now a giant soup of disease, decay, and regret. Fine, no problem. You're clever. The castle has cisterns, big stone tanks that catch and store rainwater. Surely those will save the day? For a little while maybe? But here's the thing about cisterns. They're only as good as the last rainfall, and if the enemy is smart, they started the siege during the dry season. Weeks go by with no rain, and you watch the water level in the cistern drop lower and lower, until the bottom is just slimy stones and the dregs of old leaves, dead bugs, and things you'd really rather not identify. Desperate times call for desperate measures. People start eyeing the puddles in the courtyard. That one near the stables, full of hoof prints, mud, and suspicious green slime. Doesn't look so bad now, does it? There's always that one guy suggests we could strain it through a bit of cloth to make it cleaner, and you try it. And it's still awful, and it still gives you stomach cramps, but at least you're not as thirsty. For now, rainwater becomes worth its weight in gold. Every time clouds gather, people rush around with buckets, helmets and bowls, trying to catch every drop. Fights break out over who gets the drip from the broken roof tile or the corner where the water runs down in little streams. It's like the world's worst lottery. Sometimes you win a mouthful of fresh water, sometimes you win a mouthful of pigeon droppings and dust. Then comes the true bottom of the barrel. Wall drips. Yes, wall drips. That strange cold moisture that leaks through the cracks in the castle walls during damp mornings or foggy nights. No one knows where it comes from. No one wants to know where it comes from. But when you're that parched, you'll press your tongue against the stone and lap up whatever you can get. Dignity, that dried up faster than the cistern. And then there's the real hero of medieval hydration. Beer. Not the rich, foamy ale you're imagining. Think of it more like weak, cloudy liquid bread. But it's wet. It's safer than water, because the brewing process kills some of the nasty stuff. And best of all, it makes you care slightly less about the fact that you're trapped in a death box with 300 of your closest unwashed friends. Suddenly, beer rations become the most precious commodity in the castle. People would trade their boots, their belts, even their last crust of bread for an extra cup. The lucky few with connections to the kitchen staff or the lord's cellar guard their mug like a dragon hoards gold. And let's be honest, the slight buzz from the beer also helps you forget that the enemy is still out there, waiting. But before you get too excited about your new beer-based diet, let's not forget supplies run low, fast. Pretty soon the beer barrels are as empty as your stomach, and then you're back to square one, staring at puddles, wall drips, and maybe trying to remember if wax melts down into anything drinkable. It doesn't. Don't try. And just to rub salt in the wound, or dust, because salt's probably run out too. The besiegers know you're thirsty. They know your well is poisoned. They know your cistern's dry, so they make a show of their own abundance. Maybe they fill buckets from the nearby river, pour them out in full view of the castle walls, laughing as they waste what you'd give anything to sip. Maybe they water their horses right where you can see. Maybe they just lounge around clean and smug, while you eye the muddy puddle under the latrine outflow and wonder, if I strain it enough. So there you have it, siege hydration at its finest. Rule of thumb, if it moves, don't drink it. If it doesn't move, still don't drink it. But you will anyway, because thirst makes fools of us all. Let's face it, by this point in the siege, you've already come to terms with being hungry, thirsty, and profoundly smelly. But now it's time for the real fun. The enemy's creative ways to turn your castle into a giant flaming death trap. If you thought you were just going to sit behind your walls and wait this thing out, think again, because the besiegers, they're bored too, and nothing cures boredom like setting stuff on fire and hurling it at your face. First up, flaming arrows. The medieval equivalent of a passive-aggressive email. Except instead of making you feel bad, they make your roof burst into flames. The enemy archers line up, dip their arrowheads in pitch or tar, set them alight, and let fly. The first few volleys are kind of impressive actually, little trails of fire streaking across the sky, almost pretty, until they land on the thatched roof of the stables. And suddenly the entire structure is a blazing inferno. And here's the thing about medieval firefighting. It's terrible. Your main tool is a bucket that probably leaks, because it's been sitting in the corner for the last 5 years, quietly falling apart. There's no fire brigade, no hoses, no clever system of water pumps, just you, your fellow doomed defenders. And the slow, humiliating realization that no matter how fast you run, the fire is faster. The best case scenario, it rains a lot. The worst case scenario, well, look around. You're standing in it. Once the enemy tires of arrows, they move on to catapults. And not just stones. Oh no, that would be far too straightforward. Sure, they start with rocks. Big, heavy rocks that crash into your walls and make the entire castle shudder like it's about to fall apart. You can actually see the cracks spreading in the mortar. Every hit shakes dust down from the ceilings, and the whole place starts to look less like a proud fortress and more like a sad, giant, crumbly biscuit. But soon the rocks get boring. That's when they break out the firepots. These are clay jars filled with burning tar, pitch, or oil. The catapults hurl them over your walls, and they burst on impact, sending flames and sticky black goop in every direction. You can try throwing dirt on it. You can try smothering it with wet rags. You can try running in circles and yelling at it. Nothing works. It just keeps burning. Then comes the true medieval artillery highlight. Dead animals. Because why simply try to crush you, or burn you, when they can also make you sick at the same time? The besiegers start launching dead cows, dead horses, sometimes even dead people over your walls. The goal? To spread disease, rot, and despair. Imagine waking up to find a decomposing donkey in what's left of your courtyard garden. The smell hits you before the sight does. You gag, you curse, and then you realize you're the lucky one who gets to help move it, before it attracts more rats, more flies, and possibly some kind of plague. And let's talk about castle repairs during this onslaught. Every time a stone cracks or a wall crumbles, you spring into action with your repair kit. Mud, sticks, broken bits of wood, and a whole lot of wishful thinking. You slap mud into the cracks like it's going to hold back a catapult stone. You wedge planks into holes where actual masonry used to be, and try not to think about how laughably fragile it all is. Someone suggests using their shield as a patch. Someone else just starts praying louder. Positive thinking becomes your main construction material. That'll hold for a bit, you say, eyeing the wall bulging inward like a giant is leaning on it. That crack's not too bad, you claim, as it snakes all the way from the parapet to the ground. Deep down you know it's all doomed. But what else can you do? The enemy isn't taking a break, and there's no magical reinforcement army coming over the hill. It's just you, your mud patches, and a whole lot of increasingly creative swearing. Meanwhile, the enemy seems to be having the time of their lives. You can hear them laughing down in their camps, cheering every time they score a direct hit, or see another plume of smoke rise from your courtyard. When they run out of dead animals, they improvise. They'll launch whatever's at hand, barrels of filth, garbage, maybe even messages tied to rocks that say things like, "Ready to surrender yet?" or "We're having roast pig tonight. Want some?" So that's your day. Flaming arrows, fire pots, dead livestock, stones smashing your walls, buckets that leak, repairs that don't work, and morale that sinks a little lower With every new surprise, the enemy lobs over the battlements. Good news? The enemy's out of stones. Bad news? They've switched to throwing diseased cows. So the walls are cracked, the food's a nightmare, the water's a gamble, and flaming arrows rain down like medieval confetti. Surely nothing else could make this siege worse, right? Oh, how wrong you are. Because now comes disease, the true MVP of siege misery. You can patch walls, you can dodge arrows, but you can't outrun the microscopic horrors setting up shop in your guts. Let's start with dysentery. Picture this. Everyone's packed into a castle like sardines in a particularly smelly tin. There's nowhere to go. The chamber pots are overflowing, the cesspits are full, and people are starting to get that look. The one where their eyes widen, their face pales, and they make a mad dash for the nearest corner. You know the one. Dysentery spreads faster than a rumour about the Lord's daughter sneaking out at night. One day, your neighbour's complaining of a tummy ache. The next, half the garrison is doubled over in agony, and the castle starts to smell less like desperation and more like an open sewer. Then there's the plague. Maybe it's not the full-on Black Death. Maybe it's some lesser cousin. But whatever it is, it loves a good siege. You've got cramped quarters, poor hygiene, and rats everywhere. The fleas on those rats are living their best lives, hopping from person to person, sharing the gift that keeps on giving. Boils, fevers, mysterious blotches on the skin. Soon enough, people are whispering the word no one wants to hear, plague, and suddenly that dead cow the enemy flung over the wall last week seems even more insulting. Of course, not all diseases come with dramatic boils and headlines. Fevers work quietly but efficiently, turning your friends into sweaty, delirious messes. People start babbling nonsense, seeing things that aren't there, or worse, seeing the enemy breach the walls when it's just shadows. The castle becomes a chorus of coughs, moans, and the occasional scream when someone spots another rat scurrying over a sickbed. You might be thinking, surely the doctors can help, oh sweet summer child. Let's talk about medieval medicine. A siege doctor is basically a professional guesser with a knife. The main tools in his kit, leeches, a rusty saw, and a firm belief that bleeding you dry will cure anything from headaches to heartbreak. Got dysentery? Clearly your humours are out of balance. Let's drain some blood. Running a fever? Time to apply a poultice, made of dung and herbs, bubbos the size of apples. Let's lance those and see what happens. It's less science and more. Let's try this and hope you don't die too fast. Don't expect privacy or comfort during your treatment either. The castle's makeshift infirmary is usually a corner of the great hall or a storage room that now reeks of sickness, sweat, and despair. Bedding? Straw that hasn't been changed since the last siege. Instruments, rarely cleaned, because why waste perfectly good time and water on hygiene when you could be applying another leech? The air is thick with the smell of pus, rot, and whatever herbs the healer is burning to try to purify the space. Spoiler, it doesn't work. And of course, there's the medieval equivalent of health insurance. None. Or, as we like to say, your HMO plan covers leeches, bleeding, and death. That's it. There's no magic potion, no miracle cure, and certainly no guarantee that the healer isn't just some guy who once saw a barber fix a toothache and thought, I could do that. Sometimes the Lord's personal physician might have actual training, but don't expect him to waste his best efforts on you, the lowly foot soldier or kitchen boy. The good stuff, like imported remedies, or wine strong enough to knock you out during surgery, is reserved for the nobles. Let's not forget the mood in the castle as disease takes hold. Hope slips out the window faster than the chamber pot contents. People start avoiding each other, not out of a sense of germ theory. They don't know about germs yet, but because no one wants to be seen helping the sick and risk catching whatever they have. That guy who shared his bread crust with you last week, now he won't come near you if you so much as sneeze. And the morale, at rock bottom. Between the plague, the fevers, and dysentery's delightful soundtrack, even the cheeriest defender starts wondering if surrender might be less painful. Meanwhile, the enemy waits. They know disease is working harder than any of their siege engines. All they have to do is be patient, keep flinging the occasional dead animal, and let biology take its toll. Inside the walls, you're left to wonder which will come first. Death by catapult, or death by your own bowels betraying you. So next time you hear someone romanticize medieval sieges, the brave defenders, the noble cause, the heroic last stand, just remember the true battle was fought, Not with swords, but with leeches, chamber pots, and a whole lot of unfortunate smells. At the start of the siege, everyone tried to keep their chin up. "We've got this," said the optimistic knight. "They'll get bored and go home," said the hopeful baker. "At least I don't have to pay my debts while I'm stuck in here," muttered the relieved merchant. But weeks, or worse, months, into the ordeal, something curious begins to happen. The real battle moves inside your head. Welcome to the wonderful world of siege psychology, where even the sturdiest minds start to crack like the castle's battered walls. Remember your neighbours, the ones who used to nod politely in the market square. Now they glare at you like you're eyeing their portion of rat stew. Friends turn into rivals, rivals turn into bitter enemies, and the tension, you could slice it with the same dull knife you're using to divide up the last hunk of stale bread. First we have the fights, petty at first, but growing louder and more ridiculous as time drags on. People squabble over food, sure, but not just what to eat, how to divide it. Who gets the burnt bit of porridge? Who has to drink from the cup with the suspicious floaty thing in it? Who's been secretly hoarding that one decent onion? And then there's water. The moment someone claims they've found a slightly cleaner puddle, it's like announcing buried treasure. Fistfights break out over the right to sip from a rain barrel that smells faintly of dead pigeon. And windows. Oh, windows are prime real estate. That tiny arrow slit that offers a breath of fresh air, well, as fresh as you can get with a decomposing cow in the courtyard, becomes the most coveted spot in the castle. Arguments erupt over who gets to stand there, who's hogging it, and whether leaning on it counts as using it. As boredom curdles into madness, rumours start flying faster than flaming arrows ever could. Somebody swears they overheard a plot to open the gates and let the enemy in. Another insists that a secret escape tunnel lies beneath the kitchen. If only you dig in the right spot. Spoiler, it doesn't. Whispers circulate about a traitor among you, and soon enough, people are giving each other the side eye, clutching at daggers, and muttering under their breath. The reality? Everyone's too tired, hungry, and disease-ridden to betray anyone. But that doesn't stop the paranoia from spreading like everything else inside those walls. Then there are the hallucinations. When your belly's empty, your throat's dry, and your brain's fried from lack of sleep, thanks flaming arrows and dysentery moans, the mind starts to fill in the gaps. That lump of stale bread on your plate, suddenly, it looks like a roast chicken. You stare at it, convincing yourself that if you just squint hard enough, it'll taste like roast chicken too. Spoiler, it won't. People begin to report hearing voices. Sometimes it's the enemy commander demanding surrender. Sometimes it's their dear old mum telling them off for not washing their hands. Good advice, too bad it's too late. And yes, it's only a matter of time before the rats get names. At first it's a joke. Oh look, there goes Sir Squeaks-a-Lot again. But soon you're holding entire conversations with the furry little freeloaders. You catch yourself congratulating a particularly fat one on finding that dropped pea. And when one dies, a genuine pang of loss, followed by a very awkward funeral conducted in the corner of the storeroom. Of course, the arguments become increasingly absurd. In peacetime, maybe you used to debate taxes, village boundaries, or whose cow broke whose fence. Now, you argue over who gets the chewy part of the boot you've just boiled for dinner, or whether the puddle in the courtyard is really fresher than the one by the gatehouse, or whether that odd smell is the fire, the dead animal, or something you should investigate immediately. Spoiler, it's probably all three, and let's not forget the dreams. If you can sleep at all, your dreams taunt you with visions of feasts, banquets groaning under the weight of roasted meats, golden pies, rivers of ale. You wake up drooling, only to find yourself gnawing on a piece of wood or clutching a bit of straw, like it's a drumstick. Some people stop bothering to sleep, convinced the nightmares are worse than the reality, which, honestly, might be true. Meanwhile, morale crashes through the floor. Laughter, once heard around the cook fires or guard posts, vanishes. The castle is filled instead with muttering, arguing, and the occasional burst of manic giggles when someone loses it entirely. The mood swings wildly. One moment, a guard is declaring he'll fight to the death. The next, he's weeping into his helmet because his favourite rat hasn't visited today. So, while the enemy may still be lobbing stones and dead animals, the real siege is happening inside your own mind. Hunger, thirst, fear, and boredom combine into a potent stew that no one wants to eat, but everyone's forced to swallow. At some point during a siege, when the food is gone, the water's foul, the diseases have turned half the garrison into professional groaners, and the rats have better housing than you, someone will stand up, chest puffed out, and declare, "We don't have to sit here and die like dogs. We can do something." And so begin the escape plans. Glorious in theory, hilariously tragic in execution. The most classic attempt is the tunnel scheme. Someone always remembers that their cousin's neighbour's uncle once dug a tunnel to escape a siege and lived to tell the tale. Fired up by desperation, they grab whatever tools are at hand, spoons, broken daggers, bits of wood, and start digging. But tunnels, as it turns out, are a lot harder than they look in the stories. First, you're digging through solid rock or packed earth in the dark, without proper supports. The tunnel collapses, or worse, it pops up right in the enemy camp, like some grotesque game of whack-a-mole, and suddenly you've delivered yourself gift-wrapped to the besiegers. Your heroic tunnel, more like your own personal grave. Then there's the rope escape plan. Somebody produces a coil of frayed rope that's been sitting in the storeroom since the last siege, and suggests lowering people down the wall under cover of darkness. Sounds clever, until you remember that the walls are slick with rain, soot, and possibly some long-forgotten chamber pot contents. The rope frays, snaps, or simply slips through trembling hands. And even if you do make it to the ground, congratulations. You're now standing in a moat that smells like death, facing a field full of enemy archers who've been bored and just waiting for some target practice. Stealth? Gone the moment you belly flop into that muddy water, with a splash loud enough to wake the dead cow from Chapter 5. Speaking of dumb plans, let's not forget the bold runner, that one brave or foolish soul who decides that the best way to get help is to simply make a break for it. Armed with nothing but a sense of purpose and a half-baked map in his head, he waits for the dead of night, takes a deep breath, and sprints through the postern gate like his life depends on it, which, to be fair, it does. Sadly, so do the lives of the dozens of enemy archers stationed outside, who are thrilled to see something other than rats to shoot at. The runner rarely gets far. If he's lucky, he makes it to a nearby ditch before becoming a human pincushion. If he's really lucky, he's captured and paraded in front of your own walls the next day as a warning. And what about messengers? The commanders always want to send a message to allies, to plead for reinforcements, or negotiate some miracle surrender terms. Send our fastest rider, they command. But here's the problem. The fastest rider was probably eaten by disease, killed by flaming debris, or is currently hallucinating feasts somewhere in the castle keep. The poor sap chosen is usually someone with no real riding skills, who's handed a scrap of parchment and shoved out the gate. The chance of the messenger reaching their destination, slim. The chance of their message being read aloud by the enemy, for a good laugh, pretty high. Of course, no chapter on siege stupidity would be complete without the tale of the tragic hero who tries to parley. This is the guy who, despite all evidence to the contrary, believes that a little chat with the enemy commander will smooth things over. So dressed in his best, which, after weeks of siege, is basically a tunic with fewer holes than the others, he bravely walks out waving a white cloth. Let's discuss terms like reasonable men, he calls. The enemy commander, likely lounging in his camp with a goblet of wine and a front row seat to your misery, gestures to his archers. One arrow later, and your peacemaker becomes an object lesson in why it's called a siege and not a negotiation. Now, let's talk about the really creative escape plans. Someone suggests disguising themselves as a bush. Yes, a bush. The theory is simple. Tie branches to your arms, crouch low, and shuffle across the field at night, hoping the enemy doesn't notice that the shrubbery seems to have grown legs. The good news, the plan costs nothing, and uses abundant local materials. The bad news, the enemy spots your walking hedge immediately, and your career as a mobile plant ends in a hail of arrows. And if it's raining, congratulations, you're now a soggy, muddy bush that can't see, can't run, and can't explain to your ancestors why this seemed like a good idea. These acts of dumb heroics aren't born of stupidity. Well, not entirely. They're born of desperation. The kind that comes when you've been staring at the same cracked walls, smelling the same rotting food, and listening to the same groans for weeks on end. You'd try anything at all, to escape the nightmare. And sometimes, you don't even care if the plan fails. as long as you're doing something. So when you read about medieval sieges and wonder why the defenders didn't just get clever and slip away under the enemy's nose, remember, they tried. Oh boy, did they try. And the bushes, the tunnels, and the unlucky messengers all paid the price for that small spark of hope. After weeks or months of starvation, disease, flaming cows, and arguments over who gets to lick the last pot clean, there comes a point when the writing's on the wall. Literally, that last catapult stone just knocked a chunk out of it. The enemy's battering rams are pounding away like they're determined to invent rock music centuries too early. The garrison is out of food, out of water, and perhaps most importantly, out of excuses. Maybe if we hold out another day, someone starts to say, before being silenced by a room full of hollow-eyed, gaunt-faced people who just want it all to end. And so, it's time for the moment of surrender. That awkward, dreadful business, where you admit that yes, you lost. Now all you can do is choose your doom. Will the enemy offer mercy, ransom, or will they just decide a good massacre will set the tone for their next conquest? The first hurdle, deciding who's going to do the actual surrendering. You'd think it would be straightforward. The lord of the castle rides out, head high, offers the keys, and negotiates the best terms he can. But oh no, inside those battered walls, a game of not it breaks out. Suddenly, nobody wants to be the one who waves the white flag. The same guy who, 2 days ago, was loudly suggesting surrender is now all about honor and standing firm. The steward pretends to be very busy rearranging the last sack of flour. The captain of the guard suddenly develops a limp. Even the priest looks the other way, as if praying very hard will make him invisible. Eventually, someone is pushed, sometimes literally, out the gate with the humiliating task of groveling for their lives. Next comes the terms of surrender, a negotiation that's less about cunning diplomacy and more about begging, in a way that hopefully entertains the enemy commander enough that he doesn't order an immediate slaughter. There's usually some grim menu of options. Mercy, the best case scenario. The enemy agrees not to kill everyone, maybe lets you keep your lives in exchange for the castle's riches and a promise to behave. Spoiler, you won't keep the riches, and you'll behave whether you like it or not. Ransom. If you're lucky enough to be worth something, you'll be ransomed back to your family or liege lord. The enemy makes a tidy profit, and you get to live, though probably in a damp dungeon cell until the gold arrives. Don't expect a comfy room or decent food while you wait. Massacre. The option everyone dreads, but no one can rule out. Maybe the enemy's had a bad campaign. Maybe they're feeling mean. Maybe they're just out of patience. Either way, surrender leads to slaughter, and all that begging just gave them a good laugh before they get to work. And oh, the awkward handover. The gates creak open, the keys are offered with trembling hands, and the enemy marches in, boots thudding on the cobbles, eyes gleaming at the thought of what's inside. You try to act like this is all part of the plan. We negotiated this. We're men of honor. While carefully avoiding eye contact with the townsfolk who heard you swearing you'd die before surrendering. That speech, a distant memory. Now, the mood is somewhere between a funeral and a yard sale, where you're the one being sold off piece by piece. And then, the looting begins. Oh yes, the looting. Everything you have is now fair game. The enemy soldiers swarm through the castle like locusts in armor. That fancy silver goblet you hid in the rafters, gone. The tapestries you once admired, stripped off the walls. Your boots, taken right off your feet, if they're in better condition than what the enemy's wearing. They'll even rob you of things you didn't know you owned. Is that my spoon? I don't even remember having a spoon. And don't think your personal dignity will be spared either. The enemy commander might decide to parade the garrison out front as trophies. Look at these brave defenders, and by brave I mean hungry, filthy, and too tired to protest as we mock them. Your best armor, taken. Your sword, taken. Your last shred of pride, also taken. The enemy gets to decide who lives, who dies, and who gets sold off as a slave for a few extra coins. And the worst part? The ambiguity of mercy. Maybe the enemy commander promises not to kill everyone. That sounds good, right? But notice he didn't say who he wouldn't kill. Maybe he spares the lord, but not the garrison. Maybe he lets the women and children go, but not the men. Maybe he means not everyone right now. And the executions start after lunch. As you stand there watching your life get packed into someone else's loot sacks, you realize surrender is just the beginning of a whole new kind of misery. So next time you read about a castle surrendering with honor in some history book, remember this: behind those polite words was a nightmare of fear, shame, and the cold reality that everything you fought for is now someone else's prize. So the siege is over, the enemy has left, or perhaps they've decided your castle wasn't worth keeping and simply moved on to find someone else's home to ruin. The gates are splintered, the walls charred and crumbling, the once proud banners that flew above your towers, either stolen or hanging in tatters, flapping weakly in the breeze like your last shred of self-respect. And you, congratulations, you're now homeless. Walking out of your ruined castle is an experience somewhere between heartbreaking and humiliating. The place that once felt like a fortress, a home and a symbol of your family's strength, is now little more than a burnt-out skeleton of stone and ash. You shuffle out through the broken gates, stepping over debris, discarded weapons, and the occasional unpleasant surprise left by the victors. There's no cheering crowd waiting to greet you, no band playing heroic tunes, just silence, smoke, and the occasional raven eyeing you like it's already planning your funeral feast. And then comes the sobering realization. Where do you go now? There's no cozy inn waiting to take in a destitute lord and his ragged band of survivors. The nearby villagers probably fared no better, pillaged by the enemy on their way in or out. Your neighbors, if they weren't slaughtered or robbed, they're likely bolting their doors at the sight of you. After all, associating with the guy who just lost his castle isn't exactly good for their own security. You've gone from castle lord to wandering beggar in the time it takes for a battering ram to splinter your front door. Now begins the joy of rebuilding, which is really just a polite way of saying, time to grovel for help. You send word to your liege lord or the king, if he hasn't already heard about your magnificent failure, and humbly request funds, men, and supplies to rebuild. The royal treasurer will review your plea and file it under. We'll get to it eventually, somewhere between fix the royal latrines and buy more peacock feathers for the queen's hats. If you're lucky, maybe you'll get a few coins or a cartload of timber. If you're really lucky, maybe they'll remember your name at all. Until then, you're left patching holes with mud, sticks, and your own tears. Of course, everyone loves a good story, and guess who just became the punchline of every tavern joke within 100 miles? That's right, you. The bards will sing of the mighty lord who bravely defended his castle until he didn't. The peasants will whisper about how you surrendered without so much as a final charge, or how you tried to parley and got out-negotiated by a man who smelled like boiled cabbage. Even your so-called friends will tell the tale of your siege as a cautionary fable. Don't build your keep like that idiot over on the hill, and if you think you can slip into the tavern unnoticed to drown your sorrows in ale, forget it. The moment you step inside, it's all eyes on you, the walking, talking reminder of how not to defend a castle. Oh, and let's not forget the personal cost. You lost your home, your lands, what's left of them after the enemy trampled everything flat, and your treasure. Your wardrobe is down to the threadbare tunic on your back, because the enemy looted everything from your best armor to your last good pair of shoes. But hey, you're alive. Barely. Your dignity. That didn't survive the siege. It was last seen being carted off, along with your silverware. If by some miracle you do get help rebuilding, you'll spend the next few years supervising the slow, painful process of putting your world back together. Stone by stone, timber by timber, all while knowing that the next band of raiders could show up and undo it all in a matter of days. And with every stone set, you'll hear the voices of your neighbors, your retainers, and your enemies in your head. Remember that time you lost it all, good times, and even after all that, the land bears the scars. The fields are ruined, the people are gone or struggling to recover, and your household forever changed. The children who grew up during the siege will tell their grandchildren about the horrors, and your name will be mentioned in hushed tones, not as a hero, but as a warning. In the end, the aftermath of a siege isn't just about the wreckage of stone walls, it's about the wreckage of pride, power, and peace of mind. You learn to live with less comfort, less trust, less hope. And as you sit on a scorched stump where your great hall used to be, you'll think to yourself, next time, I'm building a moat, a deep one. Now let's talk about the electrifying and shocking history of early electricity. Imagine a warm Mediterranean afternoon over 2,500 years ago. Somewhere in ancient Greece, a curious man named Thales of Miletus sits beneath a tree, with nothing better to do, no books, no streaming services, not even a decent board game. He picks up a chunk of amber and rubs it with a bit of animal fur, and then, to his amazement, the amber starts attracting bits of straw and dust, as if by magic. This, dear listener, is one of humanity's first documented encounters with what we would much later call electricity. Congratulations, Thales. You've just invented static cling, centuries before socks and laundry were even a thing. Thales wasn't alone in being fascinated by this curious force. Other ancient peoples stumbled upon nature's hidden sparks too. The Egyptians, for example, while busy building monuments and perfecting eyeliner, noticed something even more shocking: electric fish, specifically the Nile's electric catfish and the Mediterranean's torpedo rays. These slippery creatures could deliver a jolt strong enough to numb limbs or ruin a perfectly good fishing trip. The Egyptians nicknamed these fish Thunder of the Nile, a title that suggests both awe and a healthy dose of fear. If you hooked one of these while fishing, you might reasonably conclude you just angered a god or discovered the river's version of a practical joke. Of course, people back then didn't think in terms of energy or natural phenomena. No, they thought in terms of magic, divine will, or the mischief of unseen spirits. A spark from amber, clearly a sign from the gods, maybe Zeus showing off on a slow day. A shock from a fish, surely the river spirits giving you a zap for fishing in the wrong spot. Amber, with its warm glow and mysterious powers, became something of a mystical object. People wore it as jewelry, not just for looks, but because they believed it could ward off illness, evil, and possibly bad hair days. And as trade routes expanded, amber became so prized that Romans imported it all the way from northern Europe, hauling it across treacherous landscapes in the hope that it might heal what leeches and prayers couldn't. What's striking is that while these early discoveries were seen as magical or mysterious, they laid the groundwork for everything to come. The word electric itself traces back to this ancient fascination, electron, the Greek word for amber. And even though no one in Thales' time could have imagined light bulbs, batteries, or TikTok dances powered by a lithium-ion charge, their curiosity set the stage. Electricity began as a hidden force, one that attracted, repelled, and baffled in equal measure. And before the serious scientists arrived on the scene, it served mainly one purpose: confusing and amusing anyone who encountered it. Fast forward from the curious fingers of Thales to the polished drawing rooms of the 17th and 18th centuries, where electricity took on a new role: party entertainment. This was the age of enlightenment, when science wasn't just about understanding the natural world, it was about showing off the natural world. And nothing got people talking quite like a machine that could make your wig stand on end, or give your fingertips a surprise jolt. Forget polite conversation about the weather. If you could generate sparks on command, you were the life of the salon. The tools of this new trade were as dramatic as the demonstrations. Picture enormous glass globes, polished to a shine, mounted on wooden frames and turned by hand cranks. These early static electricity machines were the cutting-edge gadgets of their day, the 18th century equivalent of owning the newest phone or a ridiculously large television. The more elaborate the contraption, the more your guests would ooh-ah and try not to flinch as the sparks flew. These devices worked on the same principle Thales discovered centuries earlier: rub or spin something just right, and the invisible force of electricity reveals itself. Only now, it wasn't just clinging dust to amber, it was shooting sparks, lighting up small tubes of gas, and making the Enlightenment crowd giggle or shriek. And oh, did people line up for it. Scientists and tinkerers, men like Francis Hawksby, Stephen Gray, and Peter van Musschenbroek became minor celebrities, moving their gear from lecture hall to aristocrat's parlor to public fairground. Imagine standing in line for your chance to grasp a metal rod or a chain, bracing yourself for the crackle of static and the thrill of feeling science course through your fingertips. One popular act involved forming a human chain, dozens of eager participants linking hands so that when the charge was released, it would travel down the line. Some claimed it felt like a gentle tingling, others said it nearly knocked them off their feet. Either way, it made for fantastic gossip and a memorable evening. Of course, the Enlightenment's fascination with shocking your friends wasn't purely about fun. There was a genuine hunger to understand this strange force. Experiments were held in universities and royal courts alike, testing how far a spark could jump, how big a globe needed to be to generate a really impressive arc, and whether electricity could cure diseases. Spoiler, it didn't. In an era before reliable medical treatments, people were desperate enough to let themselves be zapped in the name of health. You had headaches, numbness, the vapors. Step right up and feel the healing power of science, or at least of a mild electric shock. What makes this period so delightfully odd is that the line between science and spectacle was almost invisible. Learned men in powdered wigs, who might one moment be writing scholarly papers on the properties of electricity, would the next be cranking up their machines to give Lady So-and-so a shock that sent her lace cuffs fluttering. It wasn't considered undignified, it was considered fashionable. A well-run demonstration was the must-see event of the season, right up there with a good duel or an opera, about nymphs falling in love with shepherds. And yes, some of these experiments went a bit far. Devices grew bigger, sparks grew longer, and more than one would-be showman found out the hard way that there is such a thing as too much voltage. But that didn't stop the fascination. If anything, it added to the allure. After all, what was the point of an evening's entertainment if there wasn't at least a small risk of losing your eyebrows? This age of scientific playthings set the stage for the next great leaps in our electrifying history. The Enlightenment's shocking salons and public demos didn't just make electricity fashionable, they kept curiosity alive. They made people wonder, could this strange force do more than just amuse the upper crust? Could it power machines, change medicine, or light the night? The answers would come soon enough. Picture the scene: a dark sky heavy with thunderclouds, rain lashing down in sheets, and somewhere in the distance, a very determined man with spectacles and a head full of ideas is holding onto the string of a kite, while lightning crackles ominously above. If this sounds like the setup for a historical cautionary tale, that's because it absolutely is. Welcome to the legendary story of Benjamin Franklin's kite experiment, perhaps the most famous instance of someone looking at certain death in the face and saying, let's give it a go anyway. We've all heard the tale in school. Franklin, in his quest to prove that lightning was a form of electricity, went out during a storm with nothing but a kite, a key tied to the string, and a hopeful attitude. The story paints him as a brilliant and fearless scientist, risking life and limb for knowledge. But here's the thing, they sort of leave out the part where this was also a terrible idea. Flying anything metallic in a lightning storm is the kind of plan that today would get you nominated for a Darwin Award. Let's clear up some of the myths first. Contrary to the dramatic mental image many of us have, Franklin didn't actually stand there waiting for a bolt of lightning to blast the key like something out of a cartoon. He wasn't electrocuted, his hair didn't stand on end in a halo of sparks, and he didn't discover electricity that day. Nature had already taken care of that. What he did manage to observe was that the key picked up charge from the stormy atmosphere. Tiny sparks jumped from it when he brought his knuckle close, showing that the clouds above were indeed electric in nature. And for that little spark, Franklin became a giant in the annals of science, and frankly one of the luckiest scientists in history. Because make no mistake, Franklin's experiment could have ended with him as a smoking heap. Lightning is not something to trifle with. A single bolt carries enough energy to toast you, your kite, and probably half the field you're standing in. Franklin got away with it, partly because no lightning actually struck the kite. The storm provided a charged atmosphere, but no direct hit. If it had, well, this chapter would be a lot shorter. And Franklin wasn't the only one who tried this stunt. Inspired by his daring, other curious minds, perhaps less lucky or more enthusiastic, attempted similar experiments. One of the most famous examples is George Wilhelm Richman, a Russian physicist who in 1753 tried to replicate Franklin's stormy success. Richman's setup included an iron rod to draw down the atmospheric electricity. Unfortunately, it worked a little too well. A bolt of lightning followed his apparatus straight to him, reportedly killing him instantly, and leaving a scorch mark on his forehead. You may have made scientific history, but it was the kind you'd rather not make. The story of Franklin's kite became legend not just because it was brilliant, but because it captured the spirit of the age, an era when scientists weren't just content to theorize from a safe distance. No, they wanted to feel, see, and sometimes dangerously experience the forces they were trying to understand. Sure, today we have labs, safety protocols, and the small voice of reason that says, maybe don't hold a metal key in a thunderstorm. But back then, curiosity often came with a side of peril. What's remarkable is how this one reckless experiment helped change how people viewed the natural world. Lightning wasn't just divine punishment, or the anger of Zeus anymore. It was a force of nature, governed by laws that could, with enough courage or foolishness, be studied. Franklin's findings led directly to the invention of the lightning rod, a humble but life-saving bit of tech that redirected dangerous bolts safely into the ground. So while flying that kite was definitely one of the worst ideas for personal safety, it turned out to be one of the best ideas for everyone else's. If you thought Benjamin Franklin's stormy kite stunt was as far as early electrical curiosity could go, you clearly haven't met the Leyden jar. This unassuming glass container was the 18th century's version of a power bank. If power banks occasionally knocked you flat on your backside and made your wig fly across the room. Invented almost accidentally in 1745, because what's early science without a dash of chaos? The Leyden jar became the first true capacitor, a device that could store static electricity and release it in a zap, dramatic enough to ruin your afternoon. Let's set the scene. You're an eager experimenter, sitting in your parlor or perhaps in a crowded lecture hall. Before you is a glass jar filled partially with water or lined inside with metal foil, corked at the top, with a metal rod poking through. The idea was deceptively simple. Generate static electricity with your trusty friction machine, maybe a glass globe or a sulfur ball, and channel it into the jar via the metal rod. The electricity would accumulate, quietly biding its time until someone decided to touch the jar or its rod, and zap. Experience the Enlightenment's favorite party trick. The Leyden jar wasn't born out of careful, methodical design so much as it was stumbled upon during experiments that aimed to trap electrical fluid. Yes, they thought electricity sloshed around like water. Science was in its awkward teenage years. Peter van Musschenbroek of Leyden, the jar's namesake city, described his shock at its power in terms that can only be translated as "holy smokes, I nearly died." His assistant, who was unfortunate enough to take the first big hit from the jar's stored charge, reportedly swore never to touch electricity again. Wise man. But despite the occasional burned finger or fainting assistant, Leyden jars quickly became the must-have gadget for science salons, classrooms, and public demonstrations. The joy was in the spectacle. Picture rows of well-dressed spectators holding hands, forming great human chains, so that the charge from a single jar could pass through dozens of people in succession. The first person in line might barely feel a tingle, the poor soul at the end. Let's just say they'd provide the evening's most dramatic entertainment. The longest human chain, reportedly zapped by a Leyden jar in a single go. Around 200 people. That's a lot of wigs askew and monocles on the floor. And oh, the accidents. Early experimenters were still figuring out that there is such a thing as too much stored charge. Scientists, students, and enthusiastic amateurs all learned the hard way that Leyden jars could deliver jolts far beyond what anyone expected. There are records of people collapsing, of metal conductors getting scorched, and of startled cats and dogs, because no historical scientific device is complete until someone tries it on the family pet, unfortunately. One tale tells of a group who, after charging up a particularly large jar, tried to discharge it, and ended up blowing the jar apart, showering themselves with glass shards and thoroughly wrecking the furniture. Early electrical science, come for the discovery, stay for the medical bill. What's hilarious in hindsight is how the Leyden jar's power was both overestimated and underestimated at the same time. Some believed a charged jar could cure ailments, from paralysis to melancholy, so people voluntarily zapped themselves in the hope of a medical miracle. Others tried to weaponize it, or at least use it to give a rival a good fright. Pranking your friends with a Leyden jar, peak 18th century comedy. And yet, even with all this trial and error and bruised pride, the jar taught valuable lessons. It helped scientists grasp that electricity could be stored and later released, not just created in the moment, like static off a sweater, but kept waiting like a mischievous genie in a bottle. The Leyden jar's design evolved, and its role in science deepened. These little glass grenades of static paved the way for bigger ideas about energy storage, electrical circuits, and eventually the batteries and capacitors that would power the modern world. But back then, the Leyden jar was a party trick, a science experiment, and occasionally a cautionary tale, all rolled into one. If you ever thought science advanced thanks to carefully planned experiments, allow me to introduce Luigi Galvani, the man who more or less tripped over bioelectricity while prepping dinner. It was the late 18th century, and Galvani, a respected Italian anatomist, was in his lab one day with a table full of frog legs, because what else would you have lying around? The story goes that during a thunderstorm, or perhaps while fiddling with an early electrical device, Galvani touched a frog's leg with a metal scalpel, and to his shock, and the frog's posthumous dismay, the leg jumped. Imagine it. One moment you're trying to dissect your specimen, the next it's trying to leap off the table like it just heard the dinner bell. Naturally, Galvani was intrigued. He began deliberately zapping frog legs, using various metals and electrical sources. Each time the leg twitched or kicked, Galvani saw it as proof that animals contained their own form of electricity, what he poetically called animal electricity. His experiments were simple yet mesmerizing, frogs' legs dangling from hooks, jerking to life whenever the circuit was completed. It wasn't long before word spread, and Galvani's twitching frog legs became the creepiest dinner conversation topic in Europe. If your main course suddenly performs a little jig, it tends to get noticed. In the age before horror films, nothing delighted and disturbed the public quite like the sight of severed limbs performing impromptu dances at the touch of a metal rod. Galvani's demonstrations became famous, both for their scientific implications and for their sheer morbid entertainment value. European salons, always eager for a good spectacle, hosted reenactments of Galvani's experiments, where fashionable ladies and gentlemen gasped as lifeless legs twitched like something out of a Gothic novel. If you're picturing powdered wigs tumbling off as viewers recoiled, congratulations, you're absolutely in the spirit of 18th century bioelectric fandom. But beyond the drama, Galvani genuinely believed he was onto something profound. To him, this animal electricity was the spark of life itself, a hidden force coursing through nerves and muscles, waiting to be unleashed. Galvani theorized that the body contained its own electrical system, a natural battery of sorts that powered movement and sensation. And while he was partly right, nerves do transmit electrical signals, his ideas were entangled with older notions of animal spirits and mystical life forces that science hadn't quite shaken off yet. It wasn't so much that Galvani invented the concept of bioelectricity, as that he provided the first shocking proof that something electrical was at work inside us all. Of course, no good discovery comes without its critics. Enter Alessandro Volta, Galvani's frenemy and rival. Volta argued that the electricity wasn't coming from inside the frog at all. It was being generated by the metals Galvani was using in his circuits. In other words, the frog was just the unfortunate middleman in a larger electrical experiment. Volta's critique didn't just challenge Galvani's conclusions, it spurred him to refine his theories and inspired Volta himself to build the first true battery, the voltaic pile. But that's a story for the next chapter. As for Galvani's poor frogs, they became symbols of the strange intersection between science and spectacle. Students, amateurs, and professional show-offs everywhere began replicating his experiments, often with less than scientific rigor. Some tried other animals, cats, dogs, fish, with varying degrees of success, and let's face it, cruelty. Others got creative with their metal combinations, hoping to make their specimens perform even more dramatic dances. The age of experimental biology had begun, and it started with the question, what happens if I poke this with electricity? Galvani's work laid the groundwork for modern neurophysiology, even if his interpretation of his results was a bit off. Today we recognize that the body does indeed rely on electrical signals to function, but the animal electricity Galvani envisioned was more complex than he realized. Still, credit where it's due. The next time you marvel at how nerves carry messages, spare a thought for the man who first discovered it by making a frog leg do the can-can. If Galvani's twitching frog legs were the eerie opening act, Alessandro Volta was the headliner who brought the house down, or at least lit it up. Volta, a man who clearly spent too much time pondering metal and not enough time making friends, took one look at Galvani's animal electricity theory and said, "Nice try, but no." Where Galvani saw a magical life force, Volta saw something far more down to earth, chemistry and physics, doing their thing. And so began Volta's quest to out-frog dance Galvani by building a machine that could produce electricity without any unfortunate amphibians. Volta's solution: stacks of metal discs, separated by cloth, soaked in salty water. Yes, this was the cutting-edge technology of the 1800s, a glorified sandwich of copper, zinc, and brine-soaked cardboard. He called it the voltaic pile, probably because glorious metal pancake of power didn't have the same scholarly ring to it. The brilliance of the pile was in its simplicity. Each copper-zinc pair created a small voltage, but stack enough of them, and you had a source of continuous current. No rubbing amber, no cranking glass globes, no electrocuting dinner, just steady, reliable electricity, at least until your pile corroded into a mess of green slime. The pile didn't just work, it wowed. For the first time, scientists could create electricity on demand, without needing to build up static charges or hope for a thunderstorm. Volta's battery wasn't about one spectacular jolt, it was about flow. You could wire it up, touch it, and feel that telltale tingle which many did, because safety was still a few centuries away from being invented. The scientific community, which had grown used to flashy one-off sparks, now had a source of power that could actually run things, or at least mildly shock things, which for early experimenters was good enough. And shock things they did. Picture it: elegant salons where learned men gathered in wigs and waistcoats, taking turns holding hands in a circle, while someone completed the circuit, making everyone jump and yelp like startled cats. The voltaic pile became the party trick of the century. No Victorian YouTube to prank your friends? No problem. Just hand them a wire, and watch them discover the joys of mild electrocution. It wasn't just science, it was entertainment. Volta's invention did more than amuse. It opened the door to a new era of experimentation. Chemists and physicists now had a tool to study electrolysis, electroplating, and the mysteries of how electricity could transform matter. The voltaic pile also inspired the first tentative steps toward electrical engineering. Devices that once seemed like magical curiosities, electromagnets, telegraphs, motors, all trace their roots back to this humble stack of metals. If electricity before Volta was a fickle, unpredictable force, his battery made it a reliable servant. Of course, like any new technology, the pile had its drawbacks. For one, it didn't last long before the acid in the soaked cloths corroded the metals. For another, people still hadn't figured out insulation, so holding or handling these early batteries was, let's say, a shocking experience. And yet, no one seemed to mind, because for the first time humanity could make electricity, store it, and use it at will. Volta himself became a celebrity, earning honors and accolades, including a title from Napoleon. The emperor, ever eager for anything that looked like it might help him conquer the world, was fascinated by Volta's device. One imagines Napoleon, short on stature but high on ambition, contemplating how many piles it would take to power his army. Spoiler: no number of zinc and copper stacks could stop Wellington at Waterloo. So next time you charge your phone or complain about your laptop battery dying at 15%, spare a moment for Volta. His pile may have been clunky, leaky, and prone to giving accidental zaps, but it was the first step on the long road to modern electricity. If Volta's pile was the dignified beginning of serious electrical science, what followed in the Victorian era was, frankly, an unhinged carnival of wires, sparks, and questionable medical devices. The 19th century was electricity's adolescence, full of energy, mood swings, and truly terrible ideas. The Industrial Revolution had given people steam engines, telegraphs, and trains. But electricity was the exciting, mysterious force that promised to cure your gout, regrow your hair, fix your marriage, and maybe even help you sleep at night, provided you didn't mind a little sizzling along the way. Let's start with the gadgets. Oh, the gadgets. The Victorians had an unquenchable thirst for gizmos that promised to harness this magical new power, and if those gizmos gave you a good zap in the process, even better. You could buy electric belts that claimed to boost your vitality. Translation: they made your stomach muscles spasm until you regretted every life choice. There were electric hairbrushes, guaranteed to invigorate your scalp and turn thinning locks into luscious manes, though they mostly gave you a mild burn and a frizz that no amount of pomade could tame. Face zappers promised to erase wrinkles and rejuvenate your appearance. Because why visit a doctor when you could shock yourself into youth? These devices were sold with the breathless enthusiasm of modern infomercials, except instead of TV hosts, you had fast-talking men in top hats and waistcoats setting up shop at fairs, markets, and city squares. The term snake oil salesman may have originated with dubious medicines, but the electrical quacks of the Victorian age gave them stiff competition. They would haul out hulking machines bristling with coils and wires, hook up volunteers, and deliver a jolt while cheerfully explaining that the tingling was a sign of life force awakening. And if the tingling turned into yelping, well, that was just proof it was working extra well. One of the most popular sales pitches involved the claim that electricity could cure nearly every ailment under the sun. Feeling tired? Shock yourself. Bad back? Zap it. Melancholy? Nothing like a little electric current to lift your spirits. Men were encouraged to wear electric suspensory devices for manly vigor, a phrase that hides more horrors than it explains. Women were offered devices to restore the nerves and balance the humours, which was Victorian code for "we have no idea what this does, but please give us your money." But the Victorians didn't stop at shocking themselves for health. They wanted to light up the night too. Early electric lighting was as thrilling as it was terrifying. Imagine it, after centuries of candles and gas lamps, people could suddenly flip a switch and fill a room with harsh, flickering brilliance. Pets were understandably horrified, fleeing from these unnatural suns that hissed and sputtered in their homes. People, too, were uneasy at first. Stories spread of bulbs exploding, wires catching fire, and entire parlours going up in smoke, because some ambitious gentleman had tried to rewire the house himself after one too many glasses of sherry. Arc lamps were especially dramatic. These early lights worked by creating an intense spark between two carbon rods, and they were bright enough to turn night into day. Or at least they turned your street into a blinding, crackling nightmare, where moths came to meet their doom, and every shadow seemed to dance with menace. Towns that installed them earned the nickname ghost cities, because pedestrians avoided the overlit areas for fear of spontaneous combustion, or just sheer eye pain. Yet despite the burns, shocks, and occasional house fires, Victorian society was hooked. Electricity had the aura of progress, and owning an electric gadget, no matter how useless or dangerous, was a status symbol. Drawing rooms proudly displayed electric novelties alongside fine china and taxidermy. Even Queen Victoria herself was fascinated, though there's no record of her trying out an electric corset. Thank goodness. The battle of the currents. Proof that even geniuses can act like squabbling toddlers when money, fame, and electrical supremacy are on the line. The late 19th century wasn't just a time of incredible scientific breakthroughs. It was also an era when the world's most brilliant inventors tried to one-up each other with wires, sparks, and sometimes truly appalling publicity stunts. The question at hand: what type of electricity should power the future? Direct current DC or alternating current AC? The stakes, the future of civilization, the tactics. Imagine a tech war crossed with a circus sideshow, and you're on the right track. On one side of the ring, we had Thomas Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park, champion of DC power and inventor of the light bulb, phonograph, and the world's first truly annoying business rivalry. Edison had built entire DC power stations in cities like New York, convinced that direct current, a steady, unchanging flow of electricity, was safer and more reliable. There was just one problem: DC couldn't travel far without losing power. Meaning, if you didn't live within a stone's throw of a power plant, tough luck. Enter Nikola Tesla, brilliant, eccentric, and in desperate need of a wallet that wasn't empty. Tesla had once worked for Edison, which probably tells you how small the scientific world was back then. But their partnership ended in bitterness. Tesla believed in alternating current AC, where the electricity switched direction many times per second. The beauty of AC: it could travel long distances without losing power, making it perfect for lighting up entire cities. But try explaining that to a public who barely understood the difference between a spark and a fire hazard. Fortunately, Tesla found an ally in George Westinghouse, a wealthy inventor-businessman who recognized AC's potential and who wasn't afraid to take on Edison's empire. Together, Tesla and Westinghouse set out to bring AC to the masses, and that's when things got weird. Edison, seeing his DC dominance threatened, launched a smear campaign so dramatic it would make modern PR firms weep with envy. He claimed AC was deadly, dangerous, and sure to fry anyone foolish enough to use it. And he didn't stop at words. No. Edison decided the best way to convince people was through educational public demonstrations, also known as electrocuting animals in front of horrified crowds. He zapped stray dogs, cats, and even a poor elephant named Topsy, though to be fair, Topsy's execution had other factors, and Edison's involvement is debated. The point? DC good, AC bad. Meanwhile, Tesla was out dazzling audiences with jaw-dropping displays of AC's potential. He'd stand on stage, arcs of electricity crackling harmlessly over his body, lighting lamps in his hands as if by magic. At one point, he even shot high-frequency AC through himself to power a light bulb, the 19th century equivalent of juggling chainsaws while blindfolded. His shows were part science, part theatre, and 100% Tesla. Brilliant, strange, and designed to make people forget the whole dead elephant PR problem. For a while, it seemed like the world might actually side with Edison. The fear of AC's supposed dangers took root. The first electric chair, powered by AC, in a move designed to cement its deadly image. But ultimately, practical needs won out over scare tactics. Cities didn't want a power station on every street corner. They wanted reliable electricity that could come from miles away, and that meant AC. The turning point came at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. Westinghouse and Tesla won the contract to light up the fairgrounds with AC power, creating a glowing wonderland that left visitors speechless and convinced of AC's brilliance. From that point on, alternating current became the backbone of modern electrical grids, while Edison's DC quietly faded into niche uses. And what of our three heroes? Edison remained fabulously wealthy and famous, but is often remembered as much for his pettiness as his genius. Tesla, despite his world-changing ideas, died broke, feeding pigeons in a New York hotel. Westinghouse fared the best financially, but ask anyone on the street today, and they'll probably think he's an air brake or a fridge brand. So next time you flip a switch and your room lights up without an elephant demonstration, you can thank AC power and the absurd, electrifying feud that made it king. Picture it, a packed Victorian theatre, men in top hats and ladies fanning themselves, all craning their necks to see the latest marvel of modern science. On stage, an inventor, his hair slightly singed, his waistcoat rumpled from previous experiments, struts before a table of wires, bulbs, and devices that look like they were assembled during a particularly unhinged scavenger hunt. He announces, with dramatic flair, that he is about to demonstrate the wonder and might of the electric age, and the crowd, wide-eyed and eager, leans in, because this isn't just science, this is entertainment. Welcome to the golden age of electrical showbiz, where public demonstrations of electricity were as much about drama and danger as they were about education. In an era before television and TikTok, people flocked to theatres, fairs and lecture halls to watch inventors and electricians. The term applied loosely makes sparks fly, sometimes literally, sometimes in ways no one intended. One of the most popular attractions, the arc lamp. This early form of electric lighting was a revelation bright enough to illuminate city streets and dark auditoriums. But with one small catch, it was about as stable as a fireworks display strapped to a barrel of gunpowder. Arc lamps hissed, popped, and occasionally exploded with a shower of sparks, filling rooms with the acrid stench of burnt carbon and terrorizing the audience. Early arc lighting operators would often have a bucket of sand or water at the ready, because nothing said cutting-edge technology like needing a fire extinguisher at your science show. But arc lamps were just the warm-up act. The real stars of the circuit, pun fully intended, were the inventors themselves. Showmen who turned electrical demonstrations into vaudeville. They'd set up giant, Leyden jars, coils and generators, promising to reveal the secrets of this invisible force. And sure, they might accidentally zap themselves now and then, or blow a fuse that plunged the entire hall into darkness. But the audience loved every second. After all, this was a time when even a flickering light bulb seemed like magic. Some of these shows were so popular that they travelled from city to city, like rock bands of the electrical age. Crowds gasped as volunteers from the audience were invited on stage to hold hands in a line, while a mild or not so mild current was passed through them. The brave or foolish participants would jerk, laugh and shriek as the electricity tickled or jolted them, earning applause, and occasionally a quick trip to the back for smelling salts. It wasn't all fun and games, of course. Early electrical generators, especially the big ones designed for theatre demonstrations, had an unfortunate tendency to overheat, short-circuit, or just plain blow up. There are records of generators catching fire mid-show, or of wires snapping and whipping across the stage like angry metal snakes. And don't forget the impromptu light showers, bulbs bursting with a bang and raining hot glass down on the heads of spectators. The first electric fans, the audience when they ran screaming from exploding gadgets. Part of the thrill, naturally, came from not knowing if you were about to witness a scientific miracle or a small-scale disaster. For every moment of awe, like seeing a bulb glow without a flame or a coil hum with invisible power, there was a moment of pure chaos, as something went spectacularly wrong. But this only added to the mystique. People didn't just want to learn about electricity, they wanted to feel its danger, to brush up against the raw, unpredictable force that seemed to promise a future both dazzling and perilous. And oh, the inventors milked this for all it was worth. Some added extra drama by dimming the house lights before a big reveal, or by punctuating each successful lighting of a bulb with a theatrical flourish and bow. Others weren't above a little stagecraft, coating their hands in special chemicals so they could appear to catch sparks without harm, or rigging hidden wires to make objects seem to move by electrical will alone. By the end of the 19th century, these demos started to shift from slapdash science circus to more polished and regulated exhibitions. But the memory of those early public experiments lives on, a reminder that, at its heart, the electrification of the world wasn't just about wires and power plants. It was about the sheer giddy thrill of seeing the impossible made real, even if it meant ducking the occasional flying light bulb. After centuries of sparks, shocks, singed eyebrows, and audiences fleeing from exploding gadgets, humanity finally decided that maybe, just maybe, it was time to make electricity behave. The journey from those chaotic public demos and dangerous contraptions to the sleek, silent grid that powers your phone charger today wasn't smooth. In fact, it was about as messy as trying to untangle 100 feet of extension cord in the dark. But through trial, error, and the occasional electrocution oops, we eventually built a system that brought electricity into nearly every home, with only minimal risk of setting your curtains ablaze. The key to this transformation, the birth of the electrical grid, a web of wires, poles, substations and power plants designed to deliver electricity efficiently and relatively safely. In the early days, cities were a patchwork of competing power companies, each stringing up their own lines and poles, leading to streets that looked like giant spiderwebs and the occasional unfortunate incident where someone touched the wrong wire. It wasn't unusual for city blocks to flicker on and off, like faulty Christmas lights, depending on which company's generator was behaving that day. Enter standardization. Governments and engineers realized that if everyone kept doing their own thing, the only thing lighting up would be the lawsuits. So slowly but surely, safety standards were introduced. Voltage levels were agreed upon, wiring codes became law, and linemen, those brave souls who climbed poles with more optimism than job security, became trained professionals rather than the guy who drew the short straw. Power stations were built with actual safety features, and substations got more sophisticated than just that shack with the humming box that makes pigeons nervous. The grid grew, linking neighborhoods, cities, and eventually entire nations. This interconnected web meant that if one generator failed, others could pick up the slack. It was a triumph of engineering, a system so reliable that today we barely think about it until the lights go out, at which point we remember just how much we depend on the invisible river of electrons that flows into our homes. Of course, getting to this point wasn't without drama. Engineers had to figure out how to tame alternating current so it didn't fry equipment, or people. They had to develop circuit breakers and fuses to stop homes from turning into indoor fireworks shows at the first sign of a power surge. And let's not forget grounding, a fancy term for giving that stray electricity somewhere to go beside your face. Slowly, electricity went from something people watched in awe at the theatre to something they expected to work every time they flipped a switch. It was the magic trick that became mundane, and thank goodness for it. Yet, despite all this progress, humanity's love affair with giving itself a little jolt never quite ended. Electric fences, a brilliant solution for keeping livestock in place, and a source of endless childhood dares. Tasers, modern proof that we can't resist inventing gadgets that deliver a zap when words fail. Even novelty items like shocking pens, prank lighters, and electric handshake toys remind us that while we tamed the lightning, we still like to play with it, just in safer and more lawsuit-proof ways. And don't think we've stopped innovating. Today's electrical marvels are a world away from those early arc lamps and Leyden jars, solar panels, smart grids, battery storage systems, all designed to make electricity cleaner, greener, and far less likely to burn your house down. Modern appliances are tested to within an inch of their life for safety. Electrical outlets have childproofing. Wires are insulated with space-age materials. Your toaster is 99% less likely to surprise you with fireworks when you're making breakfast. That last 1%, well, nothing's perfect. So the next time you plug in your phone, turn on a lamp, or pop something in the microwave, spare a thought for the chaotic, shocking, and occasionally hilarious history that got us here. From kites in storms to tangled city wires, from Victorian face zappers to smart meters that talk to your utility company, the story of electricity is one of humanity learning slowly that raw power is best served with a healthy dose of respect. Today's electrical marvels, safer, cleaner, and 90% less likely to set your curtains on fire. And that, dear reader, is what we call progress.